For 25 years, Mr. Krabs has been the show's greedy punchline, a crab who would trade someone's soul for pocket change. But the show buried the real origin of that greed inside one episode, and it changes what his obsession actually is. In this video, we break down the dark lore behind Mr. Krabs' greed. Section 1. The Rag Boy. Mr. Krabs has spent more than 25 years as the show's designated greedy character, the crab with money permanently at the front of his mind, the boss who loses composure over a single cent while his employees handle every task that actually keeps the restaurant alive. From the very first episode, he is readable at a glance, the cheapskate with a pirate accent and a love for his own cash register. Nothing in the way the show presents him across those early episodes suggests anything more complicated is sitting underneath the surface. He runs a fast food restaurant at the bottom of the ocean. He loves money. He will do almost anything to get more of it. That is the contract the show makes with its audience in 1999, and the audience accepts it without much fuss, because a greedy crab selling burgers is exactly the kind of cartoon premise that runs entirely on surface. Mr. Krabs has operated inside that assumption for more than 25 years. He is the show's designated greedy character, the crab with money permanently at the front of his mind, the boss who loses composure over a single cent while his employees handle every task that actually keeps the restaurant alive. From the very first episode, he is readable at a glance, the cheapskate with a pirate accent and a love for his own cash register. Nothing in the way the show presents him across those early episodes suggests anything more complicated is sitting underneath the surface. He runs a fast food restaurant at the bottom of the ocean. He loves money. He will do almost anything to get more of it. That is the contract the show makes with its audience in 1999, and the audience accepts it without much fuss, because a greedy crab selling burgers is exactly the kind of cartoon premise that runs entirely on surface. But Mr. Krabs was not invented in a vacuum, and the person who first put him on paper understood something about the character that most of the audience never learned, because that knowledge came from a real place, a specific summer, in a specific kitchen, at a seafood restaurant along the Maine coast, where Stephen Hillenburg worked as a fry cook and lobster boiler during several summers after finishing high school. The work was low-wage and physical, the kind of kitchen job that teaches a young person quickly what authority looks like from the bottom of it, and the man running that kitchen became, years later, the raw material for one of the most recognizable fictional characters in the history of children's animation. Hillenburg's manager was red-headed, muscular, and a Navy veteran, and when he spoke, his thick Maine accent gave every order the sound of something delivered from the deck of a ship rather than a restaurant floor. When the time came to design Mr. Krabs, Hillenburg adapted almost everything he remembered about that manager directly into the character. The red color of the crab stood in for the manager's hair, the naval background stayed, the speaking manner stayed, the piratical quality of the voice, something between a sea captain and a foreman, stayed. What makes this detail unusual is its specificity within the broader cast. Every other major character in the show was invented from the general world of marine biology and cartoon archetypes. SpongeBob, Patrick, Sandy, Squidward, each of them is a creative construction rather than a portrait of a real individual. Mr. Krabs is the exception. Among all the main characters developed for the series, he holds the distinction of being the only one initially based on a specific real person from Hillenburg's own life, which gives the character a grounding the others simply do not have, a human spine inside the cartoon shell, even if most of the audience watching at home had no way of knowing it was there. One element in the character was added later, deliberately, and it was the most important one, the greed. Hillenburg has said directly that the obsession with money was something he layered onto the character to give him more personality, a creative choice rather than a biographical one. The real manager, the red-headed Navy veteran with the Maine accent, was presumably a real person with the full range of qualities real people carry. The greed was imported by the writer, not inherited from the source. That distinction matters, because it means the defining trait, the one thing virtually every viewer would name first if asked to describe Mr. Krabs in a single word, is something the character was given, rather than something he arrived with, a choice made during the creative process to transform a character sketch into something with genuine dramatic potential. What Hillenburg created was a character who had a real person's bones and an invented obsession, and what that combination produced was a figure with enough internal logic to sustain storylines across decades without ever fully explaining himself. Clancy Brown has carried the voice of that character since the first episode aired in May of 1999, and the specific quality he brought to the role sits in a category slightly separate from anything written in the scripts. Brown describes the voice as piratey, with what he calls a touch of Scottish brogue underneath, a quality that gives even Mr. Krabs' most mundane lines about profit margins the slightly theatrical weight of a captain making announcements from the helm. The voice was improvised during the audition, rather than arrived at through extended preparation, which is unusual for a character this central to a long-running series. The laugh required separate development. Hillenburg worked alongside Brown in the recording process, pushing him to speed up his chuckling, faster and faster through multiple attempts, until the rhythm locked into the fast, slightly unhinged wheeze that now appears whenever Mr. Krabs is happy about money, which across 25 years of episodes amounts to something close to a constant emotional state. That laugh is not incidental to who the character is. It is the clearest sonic evidence of what money does to him, the way happiness and financial satisfaction become completely indistinguishable in the sound he makes, merged into a single involuntary reflex. For the first several seasons of the show, none of that creative backstory translated into any corresponding backstory within the fiction itself. The show offered no explanation for why Mr. Krabs was the way he was, and the absence of an explanation was not something that seemed to bother anyone, including the writers. He was greedy because the show needed someone greedy, and that was sufficient. Then, in the first episode of the 5th season, the show did something it had never done before with this character. Friend or Foe, which aired in April of 2007, looked backward through a sequence of flashbacks and offered, for the first time, a version of the answer the show had been withholding since its first broadcast. The setup in the episode is deliberately simple. After another of Plankton's repeated attempts to steal the Krabby Patty formula ends in failure, SpongeBob asks Mr. Krabs a question that might seem naive given how long the rivalry has been running. Why do the two of them hate each other so much? The question opens a long section of flashback narration, in which Mr. Krabs tells his version of the story, Plankton tells his own version immediately afterward, and Krabs' computer wife Karen eventually steps in to clarify that both of their accounts are embellished in self-serving ways, with neither man telling the complete truth about what actually happened between them. That structure, 3 separate accounts of the same events with a fourth party, confirming that all of them are unreliable to some degree, gives the episode an unusual sophistication for a children's cartoon, and it says something deliberate about the character telling the central version. Mr. Krabs, even when recounting his own childhood, is not entirely honest. He is a man who manages information. What emerges from those flashbacks, setting aside the competing embellishments, is a portrait of a boy who had nothing. Mr. Krabs and Plankton were born on the same day and grew up together from the very beginning, a friendship formed not from shared interests or deliberate choice, but from the logic of exclusion. 2 children who had no one else and therefore had each other. Both were outcasts at school, but for different reasons that said different things about each of them. Plankton was mocked for his intelligence, for the scientific obsessiveness that set him apart from other children and made him seem strange and difficult to be close to. Mr. Krabs was mocked for something far more fundamental and far more impossible to argue away. He was poor. Not poor in the abstract sense of having somewhat less than others, but poor in the visible, daily, impossible to ignore sense that the other children could read on his body every single time they saw him. His mother, Mama Krabs, made his clothing from old rags. There was no money for anything else, so she pieced together outfits from whatever scraps of material she could gather, stitching them into something that at least covered him, even if that something announced the family's poverty to everyone who looked. The nickname the other children gave him was Rag Boy. 2 words, precise and without mercy, the kind of label a child does not leave behind when the school day ends. It follows him home. It follows him into his own internal voice. It is not describing what he wears. It is declaring what he is worth in the judgment of children who had no patience for anything that reminded them the world was unequal. One moment in the flashback makes the full weight of that poverty specific and physical in a way that is unusually direct for this show. Old Man Jenkins, a background character who appears throughout Bikini Bottom's general population across dozens of episodes, is shown taking the rag clothes directly off young Krabs in public and using them to wipe down his own boat. Jenkins treats the only clothing on the boy's body as disposable material, rags good for cleaning, nothing more, not worth a second thought. Krabs is left standing there with nothing, resorting to a discarded cardboard box as a substitute covering, not because he chose to dress that way, but because a grown adult treated his dignity as a cleaning supply. The episode plays it with enough speed that a child watching would barely register the implications. An adult watching understands it perfectly. That is the world Mr. Krabs grew up in. A world in which the clothes on a child's back could be taken by someone larger who decided they were useful for something else, and nothing in the structure of the community around him made that wrong enough to stop. The penny arrives inside that world. At a carnival, young Krabs spots something on the ground and picks it up, a single coin, and the flashback gives him a moment of genuine puzzlement. He has to ask Plankton what it is, because money has been absent from his everyday experience to the point where he does not immediately recognize what he is holding. Plankton explains, "It is a penny, and with money, you can buy things." Krabs' response to that explanation, captured in the way the scene stages his expression and his stillness, rather than in any physical comedy or quick joke, is to hold the coin and describe it as the most beautiful thing he has ever seen. The line reads, in the context of the episode, as entirely sincere. Not the reaction of a child being theatrical about a shiny coin, but the reaction of a child seeing, for the first time in his life, something that the rest of the world has always had access to and that has always been withheld from him. Something small enough to hold in one claw that is simultaneously the key to every door that has ever been closed in front of him. What he does with that first penny separates the boy from the boss. He spends it on a balloon for Plankton. His very first act with the very first coin he ever found is to give it away to his friend, the character who will later sell a colleague's soul to a supernatural entity for 62 cents, who will print his own fake currency to avoid paying real wages, who will injure himself rather than let a dime disappear into a sink drain, begins his entire relationship with money in a single gesture of generosity. The distance between that boy and that boss is where most of the real darkness in Mr. Krabs lives, and understanding that distance is the only way to understand the greed that follows. Stinky's Burgers is the final piece of the flashback's account of the childhood that shaped him. The food stand is wildly popular with the children of Bikini Bottom, despite being located inside a dump and selling patties that are genuinely terrible. The appeal is not the food, the appeal is access, the experience of going somewhere the other children go, spending money the way the other children spend money, belonging to the version of the world that costs something to enter. Krabs and Plankton scrape together enough between them to buy a burger from Stinky's, a small act of participation in the ordinary life around them that neither of them normally gets to experience. When they present themselves at the counter, Stinky turns them away. He refers to them as freaks. He tells them they are bad for business. He directs them to the back of the building, to the alley where the restaurant stores its garbage. Both boys hear the same rejection. Both understand it as a declaration of what the world thinks of them. But what each of them takes from the experience is entirely different, and that difference is where the show's two great competing obsessions split apart and run in opposite directions. Plankton takes from the back alley dismissal the lesson that the world is something to be dominated or replaced, that the people who turn them away represent a structure that must eventually be controlled by someone with the intelligence and will to control it. Krabs takes from the same moment a far simpler and far more practical lesson. The man who owned that burger stand had enough money to retire. He made that money selling food other people wanted. The food was bad. The location was a garbage heap. None of it mattered. What mattered was the money, and what the money did was transform a man who ran a trash heap into someone no child could send around to the back. Every dollar Mr. Krabs accumulates after that day is a wall built against the return of rags and back alleys, and a coin he had to ask someone to name for him. The show treats that accumulation as comedy for most of its run, and it is often funny, in the way that any obsession taken to extreme lengths produces its own absurd comedy. But sitting underneath the comedy, in one flashback buried inside a Season 5 premiere, is a child who found a penny on the ground and described it as the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, then spent it on someone else before money could change what it meant to him. What it eventually became, After enough poverty, and enough rejection, and enough years of watching other people use it to go places he could not, is something the show spent 25 seasons telling, without always understanding that it was telling it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A single childhood buried in one episode explains the origin of an obsession the show treated as comedy for decades. Next comes the chapter the show almost never discusses: the years between that rag-wearing boy and the restaurant owner, the Navy service and the depression that followed, and what Mr. Krabs built out of both. Section 2. Armor Abs. Krabs. The biography of Mr. Krabs, as the show has recorded it, does not run in a straight line. Most characters in long-running animated series carry one consistent backstory, a version of their past that the writers agree on and reference consistently across however many seasons the show manages to produce. Mr. Krabs is not that kind of character. The show has offered 3 substantially different accounts of how he became the owner of the Krusty Krab across 3 separate episodes, spread across different seasons, each one contradicting pieces of the others, and none of them officially retracted in favor of any other. The result is a past that exists in fragments, rather than as a clean, continuous record, which is perhaps appropriate for a character who, as the Friend or Foe episode establishes, routinely edits his own memories in self-serving directions when telling stories about himself. What cuts through the contradictions, though, is a stretch of time the show keeps returning to, even when it changes every other detail around it. Between the rag-wearing child of the Friend or Foe flashbacks and the established restaurant owner who greets SpongeBob on his first day of work in the pilot episode, a significant period of Mr. Krabs' life is filled with 2 things: military service and what follows it. The show consistently places some version of both in that gap, even when it cannot agree on exactly what the military service looked like or what year the restaurant opened. That persistent thread, the Navy, the war, the afterwar, tells something about the character that the money jokes never quite do. Grandfather Redbeard is where the thread actually begins. The 6th season episode Grandpappy the Pirate establishes that Mr. Krabs comes from pirate stock on his father's side, that his grandfather Redbeard was a working pirate in the older, more literal sense of the word, and that a young Krabs was sent to live with him and was raised primarily by the old man rather than by his parents. This detail, combined with the way Mr. Krabs speaks, carries himself, and runs his restaurant like a ship, gives the pirate influence a weight that extends well beyond a single episode. The thick accent, the nautical vocabulary he applies to ordinary restaurant operations, the way he barks orders from his office the way a captain barks from the helm, all of it points back to a childhood spent learning the world through an old pirate's eyes. What Redbeard apparently taught him was that a pirate never lies, a principle the show applies with a quiet, dark irony, given that Mr. Krabs lies constantly and flagrantly throughout the series. He lies to customers about what is in his food. He lies to employees about what they are owed. He lies to competitors about his intentions, to his own daughter about how much money he actually has, to the town about the quality of whatever he happens to be selling on any given Tuesday. The grandfather's code, a pirate never lies, is something Mr. Krabs carries like a piece of luggage he no longer remembers packing. It defines someone he once loved and respected. It describes almost nothing about who he eventually became. The distance between Redbeard's rule and Mr. Krabs' actual conduct is its own quiet story about what poverty and rejection do to the principles a person starts with. He took over the family ship at some point during his preteen years. The ship was named the Krusty Krab, which is where the restaurant eventually gets its name despite the fact that the training video episode tells a different origin story for that same name. The piracy, according to what the show has established, was not profitable enough to sustain him, and at some point, he walked away from the ship, away from the pirate life, and made a choice that redirected his trajectory entirely. He joined the military. More specifically, he enlisted in the Navy, and what followed was a period of service the show references in multiple episodes across different seasons, without ever fully accounting for what happened during it. The Shell of a Man episode from the 4th season is where the Navy material receives its fullest examination, and the episode gets there through a comedic premise that happens to carry considerably more information about Mr. Krabs' past than the joke actually requires. The episode opens with him digging out a chest from his personal storage, pulling out old equipment and photographs from his service years to prepare for a reunion with the men he served alongside. He is visibly lit up by the retrieval, more unguarded than the show usually allows him to be, talking SpongeBob through each item with the enthusiasm of someone who has not opened this particular box in a long time, and finds, on opening it, that the memories have held their warmth despite the years between. His Navy nickname was Armor Abs Krabs. The name came from the physical toughness of his shell during his service years, a hardness that reportedly made him the standout of his crew in terms of sheer, demonstrated durability. He kept a group photograph of the men he served with, 4 of them given by the episode Torpedo Belly, Mutton Chop, Iron Eye, and Lockjaw Jones. 4 names that tell their own story, about the culture they came from, the kind of nicknames soldiers and sailors give each other in the shared life of a unit, names built around the most memorable physical feature of the man they belong to, the kind of names that outlast the service itself and become permanent identifiers among the people who shared that time. Mr. Krabs kept the photograph, he kept the trophy, he wanted to wear the old uniform again. The episode's actual plot involves him molting his shell at the worst possible moment, leaving him a soft, pink, exposed version of himself days before the reunion, which he then navigates by sending SpongeBob inside the empty shell as a stand-in. The comedy of that premise does most of the episode's visible work, but underneath the comedy is a piece of characterization that runs in a different direction from anything the money jokes ever produce. At the reunion, when his former shipmates eventually discover that the shell has been empty the whole time and that Krabs has been hiding in the bushes rather than face them without his armor, something specific happens that the episode could have handled as pure embarrassment and instead handles as something quieter and more honest. Krabs' shipmates confess, one after another, that each of them is carrying a secret of their own, that none of them are quite what the old stories and nicknames suggested they should still be. Torpedo Belly had his torpedo surgically removed after his retirement. Lockjaw Jones' famous Navy teeth are dentures now. Iron Eye's Iron Eye is made of a synthetic material, not iron at all. Mutton Chop's signature sideburns are not real. All of them came to the reunion carrying the same private fear, that the man they used to be, and the man they had become, were different enough to be shameful, and all of them found on arrival that every other person in the room was carrying exactly the same thing. The trophy Krabs was supposed to receive for toughness ends up being awarded to him for confessing, for being willing to show up in the exposed, vulnerable state he had spent the episode trying to hide. The episode's resolution is that vulnerability, freely offered, turns out to be the real test of what the nickname meant. Mr. Krabs takes that lesson, pockets the trophy, and goes back to running his restaurant in exactly the same way as before. The show never revisits the reunion or the specific emotional note the episode ends on. That is how this show tends to work. A piece of genuine feeling gets its moment, then continuity moves on, and the character returns to whatever comic function he normally serves. But the Shell of a Man episode leaves a small, permanent mark on the record, a version of Mr. Krabs that existed before the Krusty Krab, before the greed was the only legible thing about him, a young man who served, who earned a nickname built around physical toughness, who kept photographs of the people he served alongside, and got visibly emotional going through a box of the things he had saved from those years. What the show says happened after the service is where the darkness comes in, and it comes in plainly. The Krusty Krab training video, a 3rd season episode structured as an internal instructional film for new Krusty Krab employees, delivers the clearest account of how the restaurant came to exist, and in the middle of what is otherwise a comedic piece of corporate satire, a single sentence drops in from the narrator without fanfare. After the war, Mr. Krabs found himself in a period of deep depression. The exact phrasing varies slightly, depending on which version of the script a person looks at, but the substance stays consistent. He came home from military service and could not find his footing again. Depression, in this context, is not a casual description of being in a bad mood for a while. It is the word the show chose for what happens to a person who returns from war without the structure the war provided and cannot locate a replacement for it. What he found in that period was a bankrupt retirement home called the Krusty Krab. The place was already shutting down, unable to sustain itself, and Mr. Krabs acquired it cheaply, the way a man with very little to spend acquires something he can actually afford. The building that would eventually become the Krusty Krab started its life as a place for elderly residents who had nowhere else to go, a home for people at the end of things rather than the beginning. It carried in its name and its architecture the weight of that purpose, the worn-down look of a building that had housed people in their final years and run out of money trying to do it. Mr. Krabs bought it anyway, and the modification he made to convert it from a retirement home to a fast food restaurant was, in the most literal sense possible, a single letter. He painted a K over the R in Rusty, and the Krusty Krab was born. The economy of that gesture is worth sitting with. No renovation, no fresh signage. One letter, applied over another letter, on a building that was already structurally in place and presumably already contained the basic furniture and fixtures of a communal dining space, since retirement homes serve meals to their residents by necessity. The Krusty Krab is, at its foundation, a repurposed cafeteria for the elderly, run by a man coming out of a military depression, in a building he picked up because he could afford it, and because it had enough of a kitchen to suggest a possible business. The entire origin is one of opportunism and frugality pressed together under the weight of a man who had been poor his whole life, and understood instinctively, when he saw a distressed property at a distressed price, that this was the kind of opening poverty had always prepared him to recognize. His early cooking skills were apparently quite poor. One episode confirms that in the early days of the Krusty Krab's operation, Mr. Krabs did his own cooking, and the quality was consistently bad enough that the restaurant struggled to attract or retain customers, despite being the only burger place within a reasonable distance for most of Bikini Bottom's population. At some point, he hired a fry cook named Jim, who in the one episode that references him at all is described as a legendary figure in the cooking world, someone whose skills were so far beyond the ordinary that his eventual departure from the Krusty Krab was a genuine loss. Jim left, presumably for better opportunities elsewhere, and the restaurant returned to whatever cooking Mr. Krabs himself could manage, until the day a sponge showed up looking for a job. The contradictions between this version of the Krusty Krab's origin and the one told in Friend or Foe are real and unresolved. In the Friend or Foe account, the restaurant does not arise from a bankrupt retirement home at all, but instead from the chaos of a failed business partnership between Mr. Krabs and Plankton, and the Krabby Patty formula is invented accidentally during a fight over an unrelated recipe. Both of those origin stories have been broadcast as part of the same show without either one being formally corrected or superseded, which leaves a gap in the record that the series has never chosen to fill. The character, as Hillenburg designed him, and as the show has carried him forward, is someone who does not tell a consistent story about his own past. His version of events changes depending on who is asking and what purpose the story is supposed to serve. In that sense, the contradictions in the origin stories are not a bug in the writing, they are a portrait of the narrator. What the Navy chapter adds to the portrait is something the restaurant owner never quite gives away on his own. The man who ran the Krusty Krab, who spent 25 years of screen time obsessing over his cash register and his formula and his profit margins, started from a place the show only mentions in fragments. He came from a family of pirates. He was raised by one of them and absorbed his code. He served in the military and earned a nickname built around toughness. He came home to a depression that the show names plainly without elaborating on. He bought a failing building with the words of a pirate grandfather somewhere behind him, found a way to make it operational, and spent the following decades building something out of nothing, which is what people who grew up with nothing tend to spend their lives trying to do. The trophy from the Navy reunion sits in his office. The photograph of Torpedo Belly and Mutton Chop and Iron Eye and Lockjaw Jones is presumably still somewhere in that chest. The man who paints over the R in Rusty and calls himself a restaurant owner is standing at a significant remove from the boy who wore rags to school and had them taken off him by someone who needed something to wipe down a boat. Between those 2 points, the rag boy and the restaurant owner, is a war the show never shows and a depression the show mentions in a training video parody, in a single sentence, without slowing down. The greed the show built its comedy around for a quarter century grew in that space. In the gap between a boy who found a penny and described it as the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and a man who bought a bankrupt retirement home and changed one letter on the sign, something calcified, the money stopped being a dream and became a wall. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The war and the depression and the repurposed retirement home tell the story of how the restaurant got built. What happened next? in the story the show tells about where the Krabby Patty formula actually came from, is where the other great relationship of Mr. Krabs' life broke apart for good. Section 3. Plabs Burgers. Almost nothing about the Krabby Patty's origin sounds like the beginning of a legend. The formula that Mr. Krabs has spent 25 seasons of television guarding with the intensity of a man protecting something irreplaceable was not developed in a professional kitchen or arrived at through years of careful culinary craft. It was not inherited from a family tradition or purchased from a skilled cook who knew what they were doing. The secret at the center of everything Mr. Krabs has built, the recipe that Plankton has dedicated his entire adult life to stealing, the formula locked in a safe inside a restaurant that was once a retirement home, came together by accident, in a garbage dump, during a fistfight between two children over a piece of paper. That origin, small and chaotic and undignified, is the real story of what Mr. Krabs is protecting. And understanding it requires going back to the moment right after Stinky's Burgers. The moment when two boys who had just been turned away from the only burger stand in town watched that same stand shut down permanently, and saw, in the gap left behind, something that could only have looked like opportunity to a pair of children who had spent their entire lives standing on the outside of things looking in. Stinky's closed because of the local health department, not because demand dried up. The children of Bikini Bottom still wanted burgers. The only place they had ever been able to get one had just been condemned and shuttered, and the space that created was as visible to Krabs and Plankton as it was to anyone else in town. What set the two of them apart from every other child who noticed the gap was that they were already thinking like people who had nothing to lose, because they had already been told, in clear enough terms, that the world they wanted access to had no particular interest in providing it. They decided to go into the burger business together. The plan was direct and required almost no capital, since they had almost no capital to invest. They would set up at the dump, on the same piece of ground that had housed Stinky's operation, in the space that had been vacated. The children would have to come to them now, since there was nowhere else to go. The two young entrepreneurs who had spent years being turned away from other people's tables, positioned themselves at the only table left standing, and waited for the world that had refused them to show up hungry. Their business was called Plabs Burgers. The name combined pieces of both their surnames, a first joint venture in a friendship that had by then survived years of shared rejection and mutual dependence. The restaurant, if it could be called that, occupied a location that was quite literally a garbage heap, which Stinky had somehow managed to make commercially viable for years through the simple logic of monopoly. Plabs Burgers inherited that same monopoly the moment Stinky walked away. The children came. The business, by the stripped-down definition of the word, was functioning. The partnership had one foundational disagreement running underneath it from almost the beginning, and that disagreement mapped directly onto the difference between the lessons each boy had taken from their shared exclusion. Mr. Krabs understood the purpose of the business as satisfying the people who showed up to eat at it. Not from any deep ethical commitment to hospitality, but from a practical reading of the situation. Satisfied customers came back, and customers who kept coming back generated continuous income, and continuous income was the mechanism by which a person built the kind of financial stability that made it impossible for anyone to strip the clothes off his back in public ever again. The goal, for Krabs, was making something people wanted, because people paying for something they wanted was how the money kept moving in his direction. Plankton's reading of the same situation was structured entirely differently. He had taken from the years of being called a nerd, from the experiments that blew up in his face, and the laughter that followed, from every moment of being the smallest and least imposing creature in any room, the lesson that knowledge and power were the real currencies worth accumulating, and that customers were not patrons to be satisfied, but subjects to be managed. His interest in the food was primarily instrumental. A burger that people had to eat because there was nothing else was already a form of control, and the gap between a burger people wanted and a burger people had no choice but to eat was, in his view, a distinction too fine to matter much. The two philosophies coexisted in an uneasy truce while the business was new, because the shared project gave them each something they needed, and because the children were coming regardless of the philosophical differences underpinning the product. The first real test of the partnership came in the form of a customer, specifically the recurring background character, Old Man Jenkins, who was handed one of their early patties and ate it. What happened next was not a satisfied customer returning the next day. Jenkins was violently ill. The patty had poisoned him, not through malice but through the combination of ignorance and the specific ingredient Plankton had decided to incorporate into the recipe: chum, the ground fish parts and fish waste that Plankton has spent his entire adult life failing to make commercially viable as food, demonstrating through decades of attempted sales at the chum bucket that his instinct for what customers wanted was not, to put it gently, finely calibrated. The chum patty that sickened Old Man Jenkins was the partnership's first real product test, and it failed so completely and so visibly that the two boys could not agree on whose fault it was. The argument that followed was the kind of argument that ends things rather than resolving them, the kind that has been building for long enough that the specific incident that finally breaks it open is almost beside the point. Krabs blamed Plankton for insisting on the chum. Plankton blamed Krabs for whatever compromise had produced the formula in its current inedible form. Neither conceded anything, which is consistent with what the show has established about both of them as adults, two characters who would each sooner reconstruct reality than admit fault in a significant dispute. The recipe for their burger existed as a physical document at this point, a written list of ingredients they had been working from. During the fight, both of them grabbed for it at the same time, and the piece of paper tore. That tearing is the moment the show pinpoints as the origin of everything that follows: the rivalry, the competing restaurants, the decades of schemes and counterattacks, and secret formula obsession. One torn piece of paper, grabbed by two children, who could not agree on whose fault it was that an old man got sick from their food, becomes the founding document of one of the longest-running feuds in cartoon history. What each of them walked away with told the whole story. Mr. Krabs got the larger portion of the recipe, the substantive part, the list of actual ingredients, and the method by which they were combined. Plankton got a scrap from the bottom of the page that said, "in its entirety," and a pinch of chum. That partial fragment, a subordinate clause from the end of someone else's recipe, became the foundation of everything Plankton has tried to build ever since. He has spent his entire adult life trying to reconstruct, from that one phrase, the full formula that his former best friend has spent the same adult life protecting. The asymmetry of what each of them carried away from the dump that day, one holding a recipe and one holding 3 words, is the engine of the entire rivalry. There is, however, a complication in this account that Friend or Foe itself is careful to build in. The episode does not present Mr. Krabs' version as the definitive truth. It presents it as his version, told with obvious editorial shaping toward making himself look principled and Plankton look power-hungry. Plankton then tells his own version immediately afterward, and his version is equally self-serving, equally shaped toward his preferred reading of the same events, casting Krabs as the greedy one and himself as the wronged party. The two accounts contradict each other on several specifics, and the show does not resolve the contradiction. Instead, Karen intervenes and confirms the one piece of the story both accounts agree on: the chum patty did poison Old Man Jenkins, and the accident that produced the working Krabby Patty formula came from the fight rather than from any deliberate creative process. What Karen's confirmation does is establish the shape of the truth without filling in all its details. The accidental element is real. During the argument, while both boys were struggling over the recipe and over each other, various stray ingredients, from whatever was sitting nearby, fell into the patty batter, and the result of that accidental contamination was something that worked in a way the deliberate formula had not. The Krabby Patty that has made the Krusty Krab the most popular restaurant in Bikini Bottom, the one product Mr. Krabs has spent his entire adult life treating as the key to everything he has built, was created by chaos rather than craft. Ingredients fell in. The accident tasted better than the intention. This detail, the accidental origin of the formula, is one the show has never drawn much explicit attention to in later episodes. The Krabby Patty is consistently framed as something precious and irreplaceable, something that took skill and intention to produce, and that could not be reconstructed by anyone lacking the original document. Plankton's obsession with stealing the formula, rather than simply developing his own better recipe, is played as a character trait, revealing his envy and fixation. What the Friend or Foe flashback quietly establishes underneath all of that is that the original formula was not the product of exceptional culinary skill. It was the product of a fight, and the specific ingredients that fell into the batter were, in the most technical sense, random. The secrecy Mr. Krabs maintains around the formula is real, and the formula presumably does contain specific ingredients in specific quantities that produce the results that keep customers coming back. But the grandeur he has attached to it over the years, the mythology of a carefully guarded secret developed through mastery, sits at some remove from a recipe that achieved its final form when two children knocked things into a batter while grabbing at each other over a torn piece of paper. Plankton left the dump without the recipe and went in the direction his half of the argument had always been pointing. He built the chum bucket directly across the street from wherever Krabs eventually established himself, a positioning that can only be read as a choice to remain in direct, constant sight of the person who had the other half of what he felt he was owed. The restaurant has never succeeded by any commercial measure. The chum he serves has never attracted meaningful custom. Every plan to reverse that failure has involved acquiring the Krabby Patty formula rather than developing anything of his own, which points to something the show rarely acknowledges directly. Plankton does not actually believe he can create something better. He only wants what was taken from him, or what he believes was taken from him, in a dump, on a day when neither of them was really in control of anything. Mr. Krabs, for his part, took the formula and eventually built the Krusty Krab around it, working through the Navy and the post-war depression and the bankrupt retirement home to arrive at a situation where the thing he happened to be holding after the fight was the thing producing his income. He has treated it accordingly ever since, as the central load-bearing element of everything he has built, the one thing that cannot be lost or shared or replicated, because losing it would mean losing the foundation of every dollar that followed. Whether the formula is as irreplaceable as he treats it, whether a slightly different combination of randomly falling ingredients would have produced something equally good, is a question the show raises implicitly through the friend or foe flashback without ever pressing the characters to answer it. What is clearer than the formula's precise value is what the day in the dump cost Mr. Krabs personally, beyond the business implications. Plankton was the first friend he ever had. Given the childhood the show has depicted, the poverty and the isolation, and the nickname that followed him into high school, it is not overstating the case to say Plankton was probably the only genuine friend he had during those years. The two of them were bound together by shared exclusion, by the experience of being the children nobody else wanted around, and that bond had survived years of everything the world threw at them before a piece of paper tore, and each of them grabbed their half and walked in opposite directions. Mr. Krabs has not, in any episode of the show across its entire run, demonstrated anything resembling a close adult friendship of the kind that friendship represented. He has employees, a daughter, a girlfriend, business rivals, and a town full of customers. He does not have, anywhere in the show's record, a relationship that carries the specific quality of what he had with Plankton before the dump, the mutual recognition between two people who understand each other's experience because they have been through the same thing. The rivalry that replaced it is the longest and most consistent relationship in his adult life. He and Plankton have been adversaries for longer than most of the other characters have existed in his world at all, and the adversarial structure carries an intimacy of its own, a daily engagement, a detailed knowledge of the other person's patterns and weaknesses and limits that in a different arrangement of circumstances might look exactly like friendship. The Krabby Patty formula that Mr. Krabs guards so obsessively in his restaurant safe is not just a recipe. Inside the logic the friend or foe episode builds, it is also the physical residue of the last relationship he ever fully trusted, preserved in a document whose other half is sitting in the possession of the one person in Bikini Bottom who understands, without needing it explained, exactly what Mr. Krabs started with, and exactly what he had to go through to get where he ended up. Neither of them will say that out loud. The show is not built to say that out loud. But underneath every scheme Plankton launches to steal the formula, and every measure Krabs takes to prevent it, there are two boys standing in a garbage dump arguing over a piece of paper, and neither of them ever really walked away from that afternoon. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The formula at the center of Mr. Krabs' entire adult life was born from chaos and ended a friendship, and he has spent every year since treating it like a reason to justify almost anything. What happens when that justification reaches its most extreme point comes next, in an episode that makes the case for Mr. Krabs as something darker than a greedy punchline. Section 4, 62 cents. Closing time at the Krusty Krab is usually SpongeBob's lowest point of the day. While Squidward treats the end of the shift as something approaching a religious experience, switching the open sign to closed, with the visible relief of a man who has just been released from a sentence, SpongeBob treats it as a small, daily grief, the moment the thing he loves most has to stop for the night. That gap between them, one character for whom work is the whole point, and one for whom it is an inconvenience to be survived, runs through most of the show's early seasons as a background condition that requires no explanation and receives none. Born Again Krabs, which aired in October of 2003 as part of the show's third season, begins at closing time, and it begins with SpongeBob noticing something on the kitchen floor that the episode treats as innocent before it becomes something considerably more troubling. Under the grill, in the space where debris accumulates over the course of any busy kitchen's operation, a Krabby Patty has been sitting for an unknown length of time. The show does not specify how long. It is old enough to have hardened, cold, discolored, in the condition of something that has been there long enough that whoever left it there stopped thinking about it. SpongeBob picks it up and treats it with genuine tenderness, talking to it softly, taking it seriously as a patty that deserves to be cared for even in its current state. Mr. Krabs, discovering the old patty before SpongeBob can do anything responsible with it, immediately sees something SpongeBob does not. He sees potential revenue. The patty is old and clearly inedible, and Mr. Krabs knows it, because even he takes a single bite of it out of stubborn pride and is carried to the hospital on the strength of that one bite alone, his body rejecting it almost immediately after ingestion. The logical response to that experience, the response a reasonable person has after being hospitalized by something they ate, is to accept the evidence and discard the rest of the offending item. Mr. Krabs' response, as he is being transported to the hospital, is to instruct SpongeBob to wrap it up carefully, because he has not finished eating it yet. The hospital sequence becomes something the episode treats with a kind of strange, hovering seriousness that sits slightly apart from the comedy built around it. Mr. Krabs is badly enough off that the doctor who attends to him delivers a verdict suggesting he may not recover, which SpongeBob accepts with total, open-hearted grief, breaking down completely at the prospect of losing his boss with an emotional weight that is, again, disproportionate to the relationship the show usually depicts between them. He does not cry because he is losing his employer. He cries because he genuinely loves this man, with the uncomplicated, unwavering devotion that defines almost every relationship SpongeBob forms. The crab who will not stop calculating profit margins long enough to notice that SpongeBob has held together the Krusty Krab for years on essentially nothing, has an employee who weeps at the idea of losing him. What Mr. Krabs encounters on the other side of consciousness is the Flying Dutchman, one of the show's recurring supernatural figures, a ghost pirate who functions in the show's universe as something between a mischief maker and a literal collector of souls. In the logic of this particular episode, the Dutchman has a more specific role. He appears to Mr. Krabs as a figure of genuine cosmic authority, a version of the Grim Reaper operating within the specific mythology of this underwater world, and he tells Mr. Krabs plainly that his time has come and that Davy Jones's locker is his next destination. Mr. Krabs does what he always does when faced with any demand he finds unacceptable. He negotiates. The deal the Dutchman offers is clear, and the condition is simple. Mr. Krabs can return to the living world, but he must conduct himself with genuine generosity from that point forward. He must give, rather than take. He must treat others with the open-handedness that has been the opposite of his defining characteristic for his entire adult life. Mr. Krabs, facing the alternative, agrees without much hesitation, and the episode follows him back into the Krusty Krab to watch what a generous version of Eugene Krabs actually looks like in operation. It looks, briefly, like something approaching a good place. He creates an employee lounge. He offers free food to customers who want it. He gives away refills without being asked. The restaurant operates for a short period under conditions that would strike any customer as an improvement. A version of the Krusty Krab that functions as though the person running it is actually invested in the experience of the people inside it, rather than simply in the money they bring with them. SpongeBob is thrilled. The customers are thrilled. The show allows this version of Mr. Krabs a few minutes of screen time, long enough for the audience to register what it looks like, before the episode brings the mechanism that ends it. The hospital bill arrives. It is substantial, in the range of $10,000. And Mr. Krabs' first response is to insist, with complete confidence, that he must still be unconscious and dreaming, because a person in full possession of their waking faculties would not be confronted with a number that large without any preparation. SpongeBob and Squidward both confirm, one gently and one with his characteristic flat delivery, that he is entirely awake. He has the bill in his hand. The number is real, and the moment that confirmation lands, every piece of the generosity built during his recovery collapses simultaneously and completely. The free food disappears. The employee lounge disappears. The refills disappear. One customer who has been counting on a free item finds Mr. Krabs attempting to physically remove an arm over the matter of a single found penny. The Flying Dutchman returns. The deal has been broken, and the Dutchman is there to collect what was agreed upon. He intends to take Mr. Krabs back to Davy Jones' locker, and the situation is moving in that direction when SpongeBob steps in. The scene that follows is the episode's most important piece of writing, and it is worth understanding precisely because of what Mr. Krabs does inside it. SpongeBob defends his boss with total sincerity, the way he defends most things he loves, without strategy or self-preservation, simply because he believes what he is saying and cannot imagine pretending otherwise. He argues that Mr. Krabs is genuinely generous, that the Flying Dutchman has the wrong read on the man standing in front of him. The Dutchman, who has presumably been doing this job long enough to know a bargaining position when he hears one, offers to settle the argument through a test. He will give Mr. Krabs a simple choice, and let the outcome speak for itself. The choice is between SpongeBob and the contents of the Dutchman's pocket. Mr. Krabs asks, immediately and without any apparent self-consciousness, how much money they are talking about. The Dutchman opens his hand. 62 cents. 3 coins. The accumulated pocket change of a supernatural entity, amounting to less than $1 by any reasonable accounting. Mr. Krabs looks at SpongeBob, who is standing there having just publicly staked his soul on the belief that his boss would choose him, and he takes the money. The Dutchman lifts SpongeBob and begins carrying him toward Davy Jones' locker. SpongeBob does not fight this. He does not seem angry. His expression, in the moment before he disappears, carries more bewilderment than anything harder, the specific confusion of someone who genuinely cannot reconcile the world in front of them with the world they believed in moments earlier. He bet his soul that Mr. Krabs would choose him, and discovered that Mr. Krabs had a price. The price was 62 cents. Squidward, who has spent most of his working life expressing contempt for both Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob with roughly equal enthusiasm, turns to his employer in the immediate aftermath of the transaction and says something he has apparently never said before and never quite says again. He tells Mr. Krabs directly that he should be ashamed of himself. The line is delivered without softening, without any of the comedic irony the show usually wraps around Squidward's interactions. He watched SpongeBob defend this man, watched the Dutchman frame the choice in the simplest possible terms, and watched Mr. Krabs make his calculation in the time it took to count 3 coins. The disgust in his response is, in that context, closer to a moral verdict than a joke. Even Squidward, who has never expressed particular warmth toward SpongeBob, draws a line at this. Mr. Krabs' response to the accusation is to ask, with what sounds like genuine curiosity, whether Squidward thinks he could have gotten more. The question is not deflection. It reads, in context, as the way Mr. Krabs actually processes what just happened, running the transaction back through his mental accounting to evaluate whether the outcome was financially optimal rather than whether it was wrong. The frame he applies to what he has just done does not contain a category for wrong in any moral sense. It contains only the category of whether he got the best available deal, and he is genuinely asking whether a better negotiator might have secured a higher number. This is the moment the episode earns its title, because what follows it is the one piece of the sequence that pushes against the pattern the show would later establish. Mr. Krabs regrets the transaction. Not immediately, and not because Squidward called him out, but because the Krusty Krab without SpongeBob turns out to be something he cannot sustain, and the recognition that arrives through that practical experience carries, eventually, something that looks like actual remorse rather than simply the regret of a failed calculation. The Flying Dutchman returns SpongeBob not as a reward for Mr. Krabs' change of heart, but because SpongeBob spent his time in the locker, talking incessantly, making his continued presence there more trouble than it was worth. The return is comedic rather than redemptive, which is the show working within its own tonal rules. But what comes just before it is Mr. Krabs, in his own small, halting way, acknowledging that the 62-cent trade was something he should not have made. SpongeBob's response to the apology is exactly what his response to most things is. He waves it away without resentment, tells his boss not to worry about it, says he would have done the same thing in the same situation, and then almost immediately clarifies that no, he would not have done the same thing, and the three of them share a laugh and the episode ends. The laugh covers everything that was just said. It does what the show's comedy so often does to the material sitting underneath it, smoothing over something that deserves a slower look, with the signal that the stakes were never really that high, and the discomfort need not be carried forward. But 62 cents is a number the show does not let disappear entirely. It gets referenced in later episodes, used as a shorthand for how far Mr. Krabs is capable of going when money is involved. A piece of shared cultural knowledge within the fan community that persists because the specific transaction was specific enough to stick. The amount is not symbolic in any neat way. The Dutchman did not set it at 62 cents because the number had any particular meaning. It was simply what was in his pocket. What makes it stick is the combination of its smallness and Mr. Krabs' readiness, the absence of any real deliberation, the way he asked about the amount before he asked about anything else. The calculation took less time than the question. There is something worth noting about the structure of the episode and how it differs from what came later. Born Again Krabs belongs to the third season, before the creative shift that arrived after the first film, and the specific way it handles Mr. Krabs' worst impulse reflects what that earlier era of the show was willing to do with him. He does a terrible thing. He is called out for it by the character least likely to care. He experiences something approaching real consequences. He demonstrates something approaching real regret. The episode does not excuse the 62-cent trade, or reframe it as something more acceptable than it was, but it also does not leave Mr. Krabs as simply the villain of the story. It holds both things, the transaction and the regret, and asks the audience to sit with both of them without resolving the discomfort into a clean verdict. What the episode plants, without quite saying so, is a question about what Mr. Krabs actually values, underneath the accounting and the penny pinching and the daily performance of a man who has always known the price of everything. The Krusty Krab without SpongeBob is a place Mr. Krabs cannot manage alone, not simply because SpongeBob is a skilled cook, though he is, but because the restaurant as it actually functions, as the place the town keeps coming back to, as the thing Mr. Krabs has built his sense of himself around, depends on a loyalty and a quality of care that Mr. Krabs himself stopped being able to offer somewhere along the way between the rag boy and the restaurant owner. He traded the one person who provided those things for 62 cents, and the transaction failed not because of anything the Flying Dutchman did, but because the restaurant that was supposed to benefit from the trade could not operate without the person he had sold. The money bought him nothing. The thing it cost him was the only thing that was actually making the money possible. That is not a lesson Mr. Krabs draws out loud, and the show does not press him to. By the next episode, he is back at the cash register behaving exactly as before. The 62 cents sits in the record, permanently, available to anyone who wants to go looking for where the greed runs out of comedy and into something that requires a different word for it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Selling a loyal employee's soul for pocket change is the moment the show put a number on Mr. Krabs' greed and left it in the record permanently. What follows is a chapter from the kitchen rather than the office, an episode that moved the greed outside the restaurant walls and into a place where something living was being harmed for it. Section 5. The factory jellyfish fields exists in the show as something close to sacred ground. SpongeBob's relationship with the place runs deeper than any other recreational space in his life, deeper than Goo Lagoon, deeper than the Krusty Krab itself during the hours it is closed. He has a name for almost every jellyfish he encounters there. A practice the show presents not as eccentric behavior requiring explanation, but simply as the kind of thing SpongeBob does, the natural extension of a character for whom caring about things and naming them is the same act. His 12th jellyfish of any given day is 12y. His net has a name. The fields themselves carry the quality of somewhere that has always been there and will always be there, a permanent feature of the world he lives in, rather than something that could be compromised or emptied or changed by anything happening outside them. Jellyfish Hunter, which aired as part of the show's second season, is the episode that tests that assumption, and the way it tests it runs through Mr. Krabs in a direction the show had not taken quite this explicitly before. The episode's premise begins somewhere that feels entirely separate from where it ends up. SpongeBob is on his lunch break at the Krusty Krab, eating a Krabby Patty he has supplemented with a small quantity of jellyfish jelly, collected during an earlier session in the fields. The combination is casual, improvised, something he put together because he had both things available and wondered what they would taste like together. A nearby customer notices, tries a sample, and reacts with the kind of total, overwhelming enthusiasm that in this show's visual language signals something commercially significant is about to happen. Mr. Krabs hears the customer declare that he will return every single day for the rest of his life to eat this particular combination, and something shifts behind his eyes in a way that the episode does not need to linger on because the audience already knows exactly what it means. The calculation is immediate and total. The Jelly Krabby Patty is a product people will pay for repeatedly, and the jellyfish jelly that makes it what it is comes from a place SpongeBob already visits regularly and knows thoroughly. The infrastructure is already in place. All Mr. Krabs has to do is direct the labor he already employs toward an additional task, which is to say that all he has to do is tell SpongeBob to catch more jellyfish and bring him more jelly, which he can then put in more patties, which customers will then pay for, compounding across every transaction into the kind of steady, reliable income stream that makes his eyes take on a particular gleam the show has learned to deploy as a visual shorthand for decisions that are about to cause problems for everyone around him. He tells SpongeBob to catch more jellyfish. He asks SpongeBob to keep the jellyfish comfortable while they are being held, because SpongeBob asks him to promise this, and he agrees without hesitation, in the way a person agrees to conditions they have no intention of honoring, when honoring them would cost them something. The promise costs him nothing in the moment, because he has already decided what the operation is going to look like, and SpongeBob's comfort requirement is not part of it. What follows across the middle portion of the episode is SpongeBob doing exactly what he was asked, with total, earnest commitment, which means catching every jellyfish in jellyfish fields, naming them as he catches them, and delivering them to Mr. Krabs. He catches enough jellyfish to reduce the population of the fields to 4 living creatures. 4. An ecosystem that defined a significant portion of his daily life, that he had spent years learning intimately enough to name individual members of it, is reduced to nearly nothing through his own labor, directed by someone who understood exactly what the operation required, and said nothing about it. SpongeBob registers the emptiness of the fields before he registers anything about what happened to them. He notices the silence first, the absence of buzzing, then looks around and finds the landscape stripped of the thing that made it what it was. He concludes there are simply no more jellyfish to catch, and begins walking home, which is where the episode's second movement begins, and where the story stops being a comedy about over-enthusiasm and starts being something with a colder edge underneath it. The blue jellyfish, which SpongeBob has been trying and failing to catch for years under the name No Name, has not been captured. No Name is the one creature in jellyfish fields that SpongeBob's nets have never successfully held, which is why the fields are not entirely empty when SpongeBob looks around. No Name has been watching. What follows is a sequence the episode builds with deliberate, atmospheric patience, running considerably longer than the comedic material in the episode's first half, and staged in a way that is almost entirely unlike the tone of the surrounding scenes. No Name cuts the power to SpongeBob's house. No Name intercepts a phone call. No Name leaves a trail that leads SpongeBob into a trap, capturing him inside a jar, in exact reversal of the method SpongeBob has spent years using on jellyfish. The net and the jar turned around by the creature that had always managed to avoid them. Being captured and jarred by a jellyfish is played as disorienting and frightening in a way SpongeBob's usual cartoon mishaps are not, because the show knows the audience has the same established relationship to jellyfish fields that SpongeBob has, and something that has always been a source of gentle, cheerful adventure, becoming suddenly dark and reversed, carries its own specific quality of unease. No Name does not harm SpongeBob. The capture is not the point. The capture is transportation. Where No Name takes him is a factory, not a place SpongeBob had any reason to know existed, not somewhere that appears on any map of Bikini Bottom that the show has ever shown, but a facility that turns out to be operating inside a space the show does not specify precisely, somewhere underneath or adjacent to the life SpongeBob moves through every day without knowing it was there. The factory is running, it is producing jelly, and every jellyfish that SpongeBob caught at Mr. Krabs' direction and delivered in good faith, having been promised they would be kept comfortable, is inside it. The episode does not linger on what SpongeBob sees inside the factory in a graphic way, because this is still a children's cartoon, and the show is working within its own tonal limits. But what it shows is sufficient. The jellyfish are being processed. The method of processing involves forcing jelly out of them at a rate and in a manner that the episode makes clear is harmful and ongoing. The creatures held in place while the output of their bodies is extracted as an industrial product. The promise Mr. Krabs made about keeping them comfortable was not a simplification or an approximation. It was the direct opposite of what was happening inside the building SpongeBob could not see from the outside. The anger SpongeBob feels when he understands what he is looking at is one of the more straightforwardly moral responses the show gives him, and the fact that it is directed at Mr. Krabs rather than at some external antagonist matters. He does not discover a villain he has never met running an operation he had no connection to. He discovers that the operation was run by his own employer, using his own labor, after his own earnest compliance had made the whole thing possible. He caught the jellyfish. He delivered them. He trusted the promise. The factory is, in one specific and uncomfortable sense, partly his. He walks back to the Krusty Krab with a pipe wrench, which the show then deploys as a comedic reversal, SpongeBob using the wrench not as a weapon, but to fix the squeaky bolts on the door, an act so true to his character that even in this moment the show cannot resist landing the joke. But the anger is real before the joke arrives, and the episode does not erase it. His confrontation with Mr. Krabs is direct. He tells his employer what he found, what he saw, what the factory is doing to the creatures he was told would be kept safe. Mr. Krabs' initial response is to claim the jellyfish are having a tea party, a deflection so transparent that even SpongeBob is not taken in by it for more than a second before No Name signals from the other side of the kitchen that it is a lie. Mr. Krabs does not attempt a more sophisticated defense once the tea party story fails. He does not offer a modified version of the promise, or suggest the factory is operating in a way SpongeBob misunderstood. He moves immediately to the practical obstacle, which is that SpongeBob cannot open the door to free the jellyfish because the door is voice-activated, and only opens when Mr. Krabs says the word open. He says it, not because he has decided to release them willingly, but because his own trap closes on him the moment the word leaves his mouth. The door opens. Every jellyfish inside the factory, having been held there and processed for however long the factory has been running, exits the facility simultaneously and responds to the man responsible for their situation with the collective output of their biological defense mechanisms. Mr. Krabs gets stung extensively and repeatedly, which the episode treats as appropriate consequence rather than excessive punishment, and the jelly Krabby Patty quietly disappears from the Krusty Krab menu, replaced by ordinary Krabby Patties, and Jellyfish Fields presumably begins to repopulate over whatever time frame jellyfish ecosystems require to recover from being reduced to 4 individuals. The episode resolves within its own boundaries, in a way that other Mr. Krabs episodes in the later seasons often do not, with a genuine consequence for the behavior that prompted it. The factory shuts down. The product disappears. Mr. Krabs does not profit from what he built, at least not in any way the show acknowledges after the episode ends. That resolution is part of what makes Jellyfish Hunter sit more comfortably within the earlier era of the show's moral structure, a period when the greed was still being checked by something, when the cartoon logic of consequence still functioned as a brake on how far the exploitation could run. What the episode does not resolve, and what it was never going to resolve because the show is not built to press these questions at that level of specificity, is the fuller picture of what the factory represents as an operation. Mr. Krabs built a covert industrial facility for the purpose of extracting a commercial product from living creatures he had promised to protect, using the free and trusting labor of an employee he knew had a deep personal connection to the creatures being processed, inside a location hidden from everyone outside the facility, in a way that strongly implies he knew the operation would not withstand outside scrutiny. The scale of planning required for that specific sequence of decisions is not incidental. A person who sets up a secret factory inside a children's cartoon is not making an impulsive decision. The factory is infrastructure. Infrastructure requires intention. The parallel to real-world industrial practices is one the show neither draws explicitly nor tries to avoid entirely, and multiple accounts of audience responses to the episode over the years have pointed to this specific layer as something that lands differently for adult viewers than for the children watching alongside them. A child watching sees SpongeBob discover that something he trusted has been misused and get upset about it, which is a legible and emotionally coherent story. An adult watching sees factory farming built into a children's cartoon, complete with the hidden facility, the gap between the promise made to the labor and the reality of what the operation actually entailed, and the specific choice to use the animal's existing purpose in the ecosystem as the extraction mechanism. The show did not need to build those specifics in order to tell the story it was telling. It built them anyway. No Name's role across the episode is worth sitting with separately from the Mr. Krabs material, because the blue jellyfish functions in the story as something the episode treats with genuine narrative weight rather than simply as a plot device. No Name has been trying to avoid being caught for years, which retrospectively looks less like a running gag about SpongeBob's repeatedly failed attempts and more like the behavior of a creature that understood, in whatever way jellyfish understand things, that being caught by this particular net in this particular world was not in its interest. When the factory becomes operational and the population of the fields collapses, No Name does not flee or go deeper into hiding. It stays, watches, and constructs an operation to expose what is happening and brings someone with the access and the motivation to stop it directly to the evidence. That is not the behavior of an animal reacting to immediate threat. That is the behavior of something with a longer view of the situation, and the episode awards it with the one outcome that matters. The door opens, and everyone inside goes home. Mr. Krabs watches them leave, and says nothing that functions as an apology, or even as an acknowledgement of the specific harm the factory was doing. He loses the revenue stream and takes the consequence of the stings. Whether he dismantles the facility or simply closes it and leaves it standing somewhere in the geography of the show's world the camera never revisits is a question the episode offers no answer to. The factory disappears from the story because the story moves on, which is what the show always does with the physical evidence of Mr. Krabs' worst decisions. The Pretty Patty's restaurant, the counterfeit newspaper, the jellyfish factory. Each of them exists fully and consequentially within its own episode, and then stops being something the world of the show has any ongoing relationship with, absorbed into the loose continuity that lets every character return to their default state by the next story. What stays is the pattern. Before Jellyfish Hunter, Mr. Krabs' greed had operated primarily within the world of human commerce, the restaurant, the employees, the customers, the cash register. The episode extended that greed outward into something that had nothing to do with commerce, an ecosystem, a population of living creatures in a place that existed entirely outside the economic logic of Bikini Bottom's marketplace, and demonstrated that the extension was seamless. The fields were resources, the jellyfish were raw material. The promise to keep them comfortable was a necessary piece of labor management, not a real commitment, and the factory behind the scenes was always the plan. The rag boy who found a penny and spent it on a balloon for his friend built, somewhere between that moment and this one, a secret facility for harvesting living things, and the distance between those 2 points is not something the comedy alone can account for. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A secret factory hidden from the people whose trust made it possible was where the greed moved once the restaurant walls were no longer enough to contain it. What comes next is the episode that moved beyond exploitation and into something the show's own audience has spent years trying to find the right word for. Section 6. 2 weeks Pearl Krabs walks into the Krusty Krab looking for her father on what appears to be an entirely ordinary afternoon, and the episode containing that moment, one-course meal from the show's 7th season, uses her entrance as the pivot between a familiar kind of scene and something the show had not quite done before in the same way. The episode begins with Plankton attacking the restaurant, which is not unusual. He has done this across hundreds of episodes, and will continue doing it across hundreds more. He arrives with explosives and a capture mechanism, subdues SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs inside a restraint, and begins searching for the formula, which is the goal behind every attack he has ever mounted on the Krusty Krab, and the goal behind every attack he will ever mount in the future. The opening is almost comfortable in its predictability. Pearl's arrival ends the attack before it can succeed. Plankton sees her, abandons everything, and flees back to the chum bucket in a state of visible, immediate terror. He is afraid of whales, the episode establishes, with a history behind the fear that the show mentions briefly without dwelling on. Members of his family were eaten by whales at some point in his past, which is the kind of detail that functions in this show's universe as sufficient explanation for a phobia without requiring the full story behind it. He tells Karen about the fear once he is safely back inside the chum bucket, and the conversation between them establishes the thing the episode needs established. The fear is real, the fear is significant, and the fear bypasses the intelligence and planning ability that are Plankton's only real advantages over everyone else in his life. Mr. Krabs, freed from the restraint once Plankton runs, understands immediately what he just witnessed. He watched his most persistent adversary abandon a successful operation at the sight of his daughter, without any intervention from either SpongeBob or himself, purely out of a terror that arrived before thought could engage. He has been handed a key. The question the rest of the episode answers is what door he decides to unlock with it. He asks Pearl if he can borrow one of her dresses. The disguise he constructs does not need to be convincing in any sophisticated sense, because Plankton's fear does not operate at the level of critical evaluation. Pearl is enormous relative to Plankton's microscopic frame, and the rough silhouette of something whale-shaped combined with a voice that approximates hers is enough to trigger the full response. Mr. Krabs does not need to fool anyone with good judgment. He needs to fool a creature whose judgment has already been overwhelmed before it gets a chance to operate, and that is a considerably lower bar to clear. He enters the chum bucket dressed as his daughter and tells Plankton he wants to eat him. Plankton flees into the deepest available hiding space inside the building and waits for the threat to pass. The threat leaves. The following day, the threat returns. The day after that, it returns again. For 2 weeks, every time Plankton attempts to gather himself and begin functioning again, the whale is there, or seems to be there, appearing at the chum bucket, with the same message delivered in the same approximated voice. Plankton begins having nightmares. The nightmares and the waking appearances start to blur together at the edges, because the waking appearances produce the same fear response as the nightmares, and the sleep that should provide separation between the two experiences, instead, delivers versions of the same image, a whale, wanting to eat him, close enough that running is the only available response. The 2 weeks are happening after the threat of the episode's opening has already been neutralized. Plankton did not get the formula. He fled before he could take anything. The Krusty Krab is intact. SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs are unharmed. Whatever the disguise operation is in the period that follows, it is not defense of anything that is currently under threat. The attack ended when Pearl walked in. What begins after that is a separate project with a separate purpose. SpongeBob notices. He watches his employer prepare the disguise and tells him, with the direct simplicity that characterizes his moral observations in the better episodes of the show's earlier seasons, that putting on a dress to frighten someone seems to be going a bit far. His discomfort is visible in the way he phrases it, tentative enough to acknowledge that he is raising an objection to something his boss has clearly decided to do, but direct enough that he is raising the objection rather than staying quiet. Mr. Krabs dismisses it without engagement. The formula requires protection. Plankton is a threat. The logic runs in one direction and does not accommodate the question of whether the operation underway is proportionate to any threat Plankton currently represents. What the 2 weeks produce in Plankton is documented within the episode itself, which is careful to show the deterioration over time rather than simply asserting it. He stops sleeping properly. He stops being able to distinguish reliable information about his immediate environment from the fear-generated projections his mind keeps producing in response to the same stimulus repeated across 14 consecutive days. He is not planning new attacks on the Krusty Krab during this period. He is not scheming or inventing or working on new approaches to the formula problem. He is managing the fear, which is now consuming enough of his available attention that the things he would normally be doing with that attention are not happening. When SpongeBob finds him in the road, Plankton is not performing distress for an audience or executing a scheme that requires him to appear defeated. He is lying in a road waiting for a vehicle to end the situation. SpongeBob reads this correctly and responds to it as the thing it is rather than as a tactical move in the rivalry, which is the most humane moment in an episode that does not have many of them. He sits with Plankton and talks to him, not about the formula or the Krusty Krab, or any of the structures that normally define their interactions, but about what Plankton is actually doing and why. He tells Plankton the whale has not been real. He explains what the disguise is, who is wearing it, and how long it has been running. The information moves through Plankton's processing in stages, from the shock of what he is hearing, to a grief that the episode does not linger on but does acknowledge, to an anger that is, whatever else it is, more functional than the state SpongeBob found him in. The anger at least produces forward motion. It produces a plan, which involves mimes, which turns out to be Mr. Krabs' own phobia, and the plan eventually gets diffused as plans in this show always get diffused. But the episode at least gives Plankton somewhere to go with what he has just learned before the credits arrive. What it does not give him is any acknowledgement from Mr. Krabs that the 2 weeks constituted something requiring a response from the story. SpongeBob reports to his employer that Plankton has been lying in a road waiting to be run over, framing this as a reason for concern, as a consequence that should factor into how Mr. Krabs is thinking about the ongoing operation. Mr. Krabs' response is laughter, the fast, slightly unhinged laugh built in the recording booth across years of sessions, the one that signals financial satisfaction throughout the show's entire run, arrives here in response to being told that his neighbor has been so thoroughly dismantled by 14 days of manufactured terror that he has removed himself from the activities of daily life and placed himself in a road. The laugh is the center of what makes this episode sit differently than other Mr. Krabs villain episodes across the show's history. In Born Again Krabs, the 62-cent transaction is followed by Squidward's direct moral verdict, and then by something in Mr. Krabs that the show allows to register as genuine regret, brief and structurally complicated but present. In Jellyfish Hunter, the factory's exposure is followed by extensive stings that function as proportionate consequence for an operation that harmed living creatures. In Out of the Picture, the mallet chase ends in a structural accident that at least redirects the plot before the question of what the mallet was for can be answered directly. One Course Meal follows the information about the road with a laugh, and then moves to the mime plot, and then ends, and Plankton's 2 weeks are not addressed as something that warranted a response at any point in the episode's final act. The inconsistency the episode carries regarding Plankton's whale phobia has been noted repeatedly in fan discussions since the episode's broadcast, and it points to something about how the premise was constructed. Earlier episodes in the show's run place Plankton and Pearl in direct contact, without producing the terror response that drives everything in One Course Meal. The third season episode involving Plankton temporarily inhabiting Mr. Krabs' life puts Plankton and Pearl in proximity with each other, and Plankton does not respond to Pearl's presence the way the 7th season episode requires him to respond. The inconsistency does not invalidate the episode's internal events under the show's loose approach to its own continuity, but it does mean the phobia was introduced for the purpose of this episode, rather than grown from something already established about the character, which is relevant to how the 2 weeks should be understood within the show's moral architecture. The Wacky Bucks arrive in the same episode, tucked into the periphery of the main plot. Pearl asks Mr. Krabs for money, and receives some, and SpongeBob then gives Pearl a portion of the same money, and Pearl examines it and observes that it is not real currency. SpongeBob confirms that this is the money his employer pays him with. The bills carry Mr. Krabs' own face, in the position a president's face occupies on actual currency. They say not legal tender along the bottom. They are labeled Wacky Bucks on the face of the note. SpongeBob appears to have been receiving these in place of actual wages for an unspecified period, and has either not noticed until this moment, or has not found a situation before this one, in which the distinction between his wages and real money became practically relevant. The two threads run in parallel through the same episode without connecting to each other in any explicit way within the plot. Mr. Krabs is simultaneously operating a 2-week psychological campaign against his business rival and paying his most loyal and productive employee with currency he designed and printed himself, featuring his own face, and marked clearly as not usable for any actual purchase. The combination is not accidental, as a portrait of where the character had arrived by the 7th season. Both actions follow the same underlying logic, which is that other people's situations, their fears, their wages, their capacity to function in ordinary daily life, are variables to be managed in the interest of Mr. Krabs' own financial position, rather than things that carry independent weight. The episode's reception in the years since its broadcast has been consistent enough to function as a kind of settled verdict in the fan community's accounting of the show's middle seasons. It appears frequently in discussions of where the greed crossed from the familiar, comedy-generating obsession of the early seasons into something that required a different vocabulary to describe. The specific element that places it in that category is not the intensity of what Mr. Krabs does, because other episodes in other seasons have depicted intense behavior. It is the absence of any narrative response to the intensity, the laugh instead of the consequence, the road treated as an outcome worth celebrating, rather than as evidence that something had gone past whatever limit the story was supposed to be maintaining. SpongeBob's conversation with Plankton in the road is the episode's one moment of genuine human weight, and it comes from the character who most consistently provides that weight throughout the show's history. He did not arrange the 2 weeks. He did not know the full scope of what was happening during them. But he finds Plankton in the road and sits down with him, and that gesture, small and underplayed, and quickly swept into the episode's final comic mechanics, is the closest the story gets to registering what the 2 weeks actually cost. The show does not sustain the register for long. By the time the mime plot resolves and the credits roll, the road has already been left behind by the narrative momentum. But SpongeBob sitting down next to Plankton, before the anger and the plan and the episode's final joke, is the one moment that treats the 2 weeks as something that happened to someone, rather than something that happened to a plot function. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A 14-day operation that the show registered with a laugh, rather than a consequence, sits at the center of the longest-running argument about where Mr. Krabs' greed crossed the line the early seasons maintained. What follows it in the record is the episode that removed the laugh and replaced it with a mallet, and a question the show ended before anyone could ask out loud. Section 7, Dead Artists Are Better Squidward Tentacles, has been attempting to sell his paintings to Krusty Krab customers for as long as he has worked there, which is to say for most of the show's recorded history. The attempts follow a consistent pattern. He arranges canvases in the dining area, positions himself near them with the posture of someone who expects recognition, and waits for customers to respond with the appreciation he is certain is their only reasonable option. The customers respond with indifference. The management responds with nothing at all, treating the exhibitions as background events that neither cost nor produce anything, simply part of the environmental texture of working alongside Squidward, like the clarinet playing and the resentful sighing, and the way he looks at SpongeBob when SpongeBob is being particularly SpongeBob. Out of the Picture, a 10th season episode, begins at this familiar intersection, and then introduces a single piece of outside information that redirects everything. An art appraiser walks into the Krusty Krab, evaluates the paintings Squidward has on display, and delivers an honest assessment. The work is not commercially significant at current market rates. The value the paintings carry in their present condition is minimal. This is not what Squidward wants to hear, but the appraiser is not finished, and the qualification he adds to the assessment is the engine of everything that follows. Artwork is worth considerably more, he explains, when the artist is no longer living. The statement is grounded in a real dynamic. The art market has historically assigned premium value to the work of deceased artists, for reasons rooted in simple supply economics. An artist who is no longer alive cannot produce further work, which transforms their existing output from a growing inventory into a fixed one, and scarcity drives price in predictable ways. This is not a principle invented for the episode. It is a documented feature of how markets have responded to the deaths of artists across centuries of recorded commercial history, with multiple well-known examples of painters and sculptors whose market valuations shifted dramatically at the moment their deaths made future production impossible. The appraiser is telling the truth about how the world works. He is telling it inside a room containing Mr. Krabs. The calculation that follows in Mr. Krabs' mind takes no visible time. He has paintings. He has the employee who painted them. The paintings are currently worth very little. There is a condition under which they would be worth considerably more. The condition involves the continued existence of a specific person. The conclusion that emerges from these variables, run through the particular version of cost-benefit analysis Mr. Krabs has been applying to every situation in his life since the day he found a penny at a carnival and learned what money was for, is that Squidward needs to stop being in the picture, and the most direct route to that outcome is the one the appraiser has implicitly described. He begins with methods that maintain some distance from the conclusion. Sending Squidward to the Arctic is the first approach, a geographic solution that would satisfy the appraiser's condition in practical terms by simply placing Squidward far enough from Bikini Bottom that his presence in the market is no longer a variable. Squidward arrives in the Arctic, finds it cold and inhospitable, and entirely disconnected from anything that makes his daily life functional, and returns before the plan has a chance to produce its intended effect. The return is faster than Mr. Krabs anticipated, which requires an escalation. Rock bottom is the second approach. The show established rock bottom in its first season as a genuinely difficult place to leave, somewhere SpongeBob required significant outside assistance to escape from, a location that functions in the show's geography as a place that holds on to people who end up there, rather than releasing them on demand. Squidward arrives on a bus, finds rock bottom exactly as unwelcoming as its reputation suggests, and finds a bus back. He returns to the Krusty Krab with the flat expression of someone mildly inconvenienced, rather than meaningfully deterred. The geographic approach has now failed twice, and the appraiser's condition remains unmet. The third escalation is Mars. Mr. Krabs puts Squidward in a rocket, a piece of equipment that represents a significantly greater investment of resources than a bus ticket to either of the previous destinations, and launches him toward a different planet. The willingness to arrange interplanetary transport in the service of this project says something about where Mr. Krabs is on the commitment curve at this point in the episode. Getting a person to Mars requires more infrastructure than getting them to the Arctic. He builds or acquires that infrastructure rather than reconsidering the project. Squidward returns from Mars because the show is not going to strand a main character on another planet, but the attempt to send him there is a data point about what Mr. Krabs has decided this outcome is worth. When Squidward returns from Mars, and the paintings remain at the same value, and the appraiser's condition continues to go unsatisfied, Mr. Krabs picks up a mallet and begins chasing his employee through the restaurant. SpongeBob, who has been watching the escalation through each of its stages with increasing discomfort, interposes himself physically between the mallet and its target, which is the only thing in the episode's structure that functions as a check on where the chase is going. Mr. Krabs pursues Squidward around the Krusty Krab's dining area with a blunt instrument, while SpongeBob attempts to intervene, and the physical chaos of this sequence is what the episode uses to move toward its resolution, rather than any moment of decision or restraint from Mr. Krabs himself. The resolution arrives through structural accident rather than deliberate correction. The restaurant's ceiling falls in some version of the destruction that the chase produces, and the merging of Squidward's paintings with the wreckage of the dining room, and with Mr. Krabs himself, creates something the appraiser, still apparently present, declares a masterpiece. Both characters receive an outcome they wanted. Squidward gets recognized as an artist. Mr. Krabs gets money. SpongeBob notes that he helped. The episode lands on a laugh and ends. The laugh covers what preceded it, in the way the show's comedy so often covers the material sitting underneath it, providing a tonal signal to the audience that the discomfort generated by the preceding events can now be discharged rather than sustained. Within the comedy frame, the ending works, because both the action figure and the target of the action end up in positions that satisfy their respective goals, and the cartoonishness of the means, the Arctic, the rocket, the mallet, provides enough visual absurdity that the underlying structure can be processed as escalating slapstick rather than as something that requires a different category. The underlying structure, however, is what it is regardless of the frame. An employer sent an employee to the Arctic, to rock bottom, and to Mars in escalating attempts to remove him from the world, and when none of those attempts produced the desired outcome, pursued him through the workplace with a blunt instrument. The mallet sequence is not staged as cartoon violence in the Looney Tunes register, where injury is immediate, self-reversing, and consequence-free within the frame of the joke. It is staged as one specific character pursuing another specific character in a specific location, and the intent behind the pursuit is not ambiguous within the episode's own logic. The appraiser told Mr. Krabs the condition for increased value. Mr. Krabs spent the episode working toward achieving that condition. The mallet is the episode's final attempt before the structural accident produces the resolution. Out of the Picture aired during the 10th season, which sits in the period associated with Steven Hillenburg's return to an active production role after his absence across the middle seasons. That return is broadly credited with pulling the character back toward the version Hillenburg had originally built, restoring the complexity and the calibrated consequences that the 6th through 8th seasons had worn away. The mallet chase's presence in the 10th season complicates the clean narrative of full recovery, arriving as it does in a period when the worst tendencies of the middle-season Mr. Krabs were supposed to be receding. It is possible to read Out of the Picture as a one-off anomaly rather than evidence that the Flanderization of the middle seasons was incomplete, and some accounts of the episode's reception have taken that position. The 10th season contains episodes that demonstrate the restored complexity the Hillenburg return produced, moments where the greed operates alongside other qualities in the way the early seasons always allowed it to. The mallet chase in this reading is a single episode following a certain logic to a certain conclusion without fully registering how far that logic had drifted from where the character should have been at that point in the show's arc. The other reading, which the episode's specific content supports at least as well, is that certain patterns established during the middle seasons had become sufficiently ingrained in how individual episodes were constructed that they continued to produce outputs consistent with those patterns, even after the general creative direction had shifted. Not every episode written after Hillenburg's return would have been written by someone who had spent the intervening years thinking about where Mr. Krabs' worst behavior was supposed to stop. Some would have been written by people who had been working within the middle season framework for years, for whom the Arctic and the Rocket and the Mallet followed from the appraiser's information as naturally as any other comedic escalation. The art-world dynamic the episode builds on adds a layer of real-world reference that the show neither emphasizes nor tries to hide. Dead artists are better is not a principle invented for children's animation. It is an observable pattern in how markets have processed the deaths of artists for as long as art markets have existed, and using it as the premise of a Mr. Krabs episode is a choice that brings that real-world logic into direct contact with a cartoon framework that does not always know what to do with it once it arrives. The appraiser's observation is accurate. Mr. Krabs' response to an accurate observation is to act on it immediately and directly, which is what he does with every piece of financial information he receives. The episode's dark comedy comes from the gap between the neutrality of the information and the totality of what Mr. Krabs does with it, but the gap only exists because the information is real and the response is cartoon. Squidward's experience across the episode carries the quality that his worst episodes tend to produce, a situation staged for the audience's entertainment that, examined outside the comedy frame, describes something serious happening to a person with a recognizable inner life. He has been the show's designated suffering character since the beginning, the one whose aspirations exceed his circumstances and whose dignity is regularly reduced by forces both inside and outside the restaurant. The show has a complicated relationship with Squidward's suffering, and Out of the Picture sits in the category of episodes that invite the audience to find his situation funny, while the underlying structure of that situation is not itself funny in any meaningful sense. He is sent to Mars by his employer, returns, and is chased with a mallet, and the show's invitation is to read the escalation as comedic because of the cartoonishness of each stage, while the thing connecting all three stages is not cartoonish at all. SpongeBob's function in the episode as the character who physically intervenes during the mallet sequence is consistent with the role he plays across all the episodes in this video, where Mr. Krabs does his worst work. He is the one who cares, and therefore the one who responds, the character whose unconditional loyalty and genuine moral attention make him the only reliable check on Mr. Krabs' behavior when that behavior moves past whatever threshold the story is supposed to maintain. In Born-Again Krabs, he stakes his own soul on Mr. Krabs' better nature. In One Course Meal, he sits with plankton in a road. In Out of the Picture, he stands between the mallet and its target, not because a plot mechanic requires him to be there, but because being there is what SpongeBob does when something is wrong, and he can see it. The resolution that saves Squidward from the mallet is structural rather than moral. The ceiling falls, the masterpiece emerges, the appraiser declares value, and the episode ends before the question of what the mallet was for can be asked by anyone inside the story. Mr. Krabs gets the money. The question gets covered by the laugh. The Arctic, and Rock Bottom and Mars sit in the episode's record without being named as the things they were, each one a stage in a project that the resolution made unnecessary rather than a project that Mr. Krabs himself decided to stop. That is the specific quality that Out of the Picture shares with the middle season episodes that generated the most sustained critical response, the absence of a narrative mechanism that looks at what happened and calls it by its name. The Jellyfish Factory produces consequence. The 62-cent transaction produces Squidward's verdict and something approaching genuine regret. Out of the Picture produces a masterpiece and ends on a laugh, and Squidward goes home from Mars having been recognized as an artist, which is what he always wanted, produced by a process that no version of the story ever directly addresses as the thing it was. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. An appraiser's honest description of market dynamics produced an episode about escalating attempts to remove an employee from the world, and the episode ended before the question of what all of it meant could be answered. What comes next is the larger pattern connecting everything this video has examined, the moment in the show's history when the character who had always been greedy became something else entirely. Section 8. The Flanderization television animation has a failure mode that fans and critics began naming more precisely sometime in the early years of internet criticism, borrowing a term from one of the longest-running animated series in American television history. The word comes from a character whose defining trait, a cheerful and devout neighborliness, gradually consumed every other aspect of his personality, across seasons of a show that kept running long after its earliest creative energy had dispersed into the effort of simply continuing to produce episodes at the required pace. When a character's most recognizable trait expands until it is the only trait remaining, squeezing out complexity and contradiction, and the specific texture that made the character feel like a person rather than a function, that process acquired a name. The name stuck because it described something happening across multiple shows simultaneously, a pattern recognizable enough to need a label. Mr. Krabs did not start as a flanderized character. The version of him that exists across the first 5 seasons, the version Stephen Hillenburg developed and oversaw as showrunner, is something more carefully managed than the single-trait figure those seasons are sometimes retroactively collapsed into when the whole run is viewed together. He is greedy in those years, consistently and without apology, and the greed drives most of the storylines built around him, but it operates alongside other things. The genuine warmth he shows toward SpongeBob in episodes that allow it. The military history The Shell of a Man episode opens into something unexpectedly tender. The relationship with Pearl, which the show allows to carry real emotional weight, rather than simply deploying it as a mechanism for jokes about a crab with a whale daughter. Even in Born-Again Krabs, a version of actual remorse appears, brief and structurally complicated, and quickly covered by comedy, but present in a form that registers as something rather than nothing. The greed in those early seasons is also consistently checked by consequences that feel proportionate to what they are responding to. The consequences arrive within the episode, address the specific behavior that produced them, and leave Mr. Krabs in a position the story clearly understood as correction. He tries to sell a rotten patty, ends up hospitalized, and trades SpongeBob's soul for 62 cents before being forced into a genuine reckoning with what the trade actually cost him. He builds the jellyfish factory and gets stung extensively once it falls apart. The moral architecture of the first 5 seasons holds the greed accountable through the storytelling itself, rather than relying on the audience to supply accountability the narrative has omitted. The SpongeBob SquarePants movie, released in November of 2004, was made with the understanding that it would function as the series finale. Hillenburg designed and executed it as an endpoint, and his intention was that the story ended there. Nickelodeon had different plans. The show continued after the film, and it continued without Hillenburg in the showrunning role he had occupied through the first 5 seasons. He stepped back from day-to-day creative leadership, and the show passed to a team of writers and directors who had worked on it in various capacities, but who were now operating without the person who had built the original framework and made the specific daily decisions that kept the character work calibrated against the initial conception. The period from roughly the 6th through the 10th seasons is where the fan consensus on Mr. Krabs' flanderization is most firmly located. During this stretch, the greed expands until it becomes the primary and frequently the only legible thing about him. The moments of conscience the early seasons allowed, brief and imperfect but genuinely present, become rarer and then effectively disappear. The consequences that the early season stories built into his worst decisions stop arriving with the same proportionate, narrative-driven quality, and begin to feel more like incidental setbacks than genuine corrections. He laughs at the information that Plankton has placed himself in a road after 2 weeks of manufactured terror. He chases Squidward through the restaurant with a mallet, and the episode ends with everyone getting what they wanted. The the behavior continues and the correction fails to arrive, and the audience sits with a character whose worst qualities are not being held against him by the story containing him. The fan community that grew up discussing the show online developed its own vocabulary for the distinction between eras. Within that vocabulary, the term most consistently applied to the middle season's version of Mr. Krabs was not sympathetic, and the comparison that appeared most often in critical assessments positioned him not as a greedy but redeemable foil for SpongeBob's optimism, but as a figure who had become, in the specific moral terms the middle seasons were applying to him, worse than Plankton. This judgment carries real weight when examined carefully, because Plankton is the show's official villain, the character coded as the antagonist of the central rivalry across hundreds of episodes. The argument that Mr. Krabs during the middle seasons was worse than Plankton rested on a distinction the community articulated with some precision. Plankton's villainy operates within a cartoon villain framework, where the schemes are theatrical, the actual harm is largely abstract, and the character himself is frequently the victim of his own failures. Mr. Krabs' worst middle-season behavior produced real harm to characters the audience had genuine emotional relationships with, without the theatrical distance that made Plankton's schemes processable as entertainment. The episode that Plankton himself apparently agreed with this reading of, according to the dialogue the show wrote for him, is the Krabby Chronicle, a sixth-season installment in which Mr. Krabs instructs SpongeBob to write fabricated, defamatory stories about Bikini Bottom residents in order to drive traffic to a Krusty Krab newspaper he has launched as an advertising mechanism. The stories SpongeBob writes are genuinely harmful, destroying reputations of characters who have done nothing to warrant it, and when the scheme collapses and Mr. Krabs loses all his money to the angry residents, his response is to print counterfeit currency. Plankton, observing some portion of this from outside, delivers a line the show frames as a sincere expression of disbelief, that he thought he was the evil one. The line positions Mr. Krabs' behavior in that episode as something that crossed a line even the designated villain of the series recognized as belonging to his own territory. Hillenburg's return to an active production role, which happened around the 9th and 10th seasons, is the moment most accounts of the character's recovery point to, and the improvement is real and broadly acknowledged. The greed in the later Hillenburg-overseen material begins to feel more like the earlier season's version again, calibrated rather than absolute, capable of sitting alongside care for Pearl and the genuine relationship with SpongeBob, rather than replacing both with a character whose only internal experience is the calculation of financial advantage. The specific quality that defined the worst of the 6th through 8th seasons, the combination of extreme behavior and absent consequence, pulls back noticeably in the material produced after his return. What the recovery does not do is retroactively alter what the middle seasons actually contain. The episodes are still there, and the pattern they built into the character's record is permanent in the way that broadcast television is permanent. One course meal still ends with the laugh. Out of the Picture still has the mallet. The Krabby Chronicle still has the counterfeit currency. Hillenburg coming back to the show corrected the direction of travel, but it did not remove the distance already covered in the wrong direction, and the fan community's relationship with the character has been shaped by both the original version and the middle season version simultaneously, in a way that a viewer encountering the show for the first time after the recovery would not necessarily understand without having watched through the period that made the recovery necessary. The Squid on Strike episode from the 2nd season offers an early example of Mr. Krabs' labor practices taken to their logical extreme in a way that the show still treated as comedy within the early season framework, and it is worth examining as a point of comparison with where those same practices ended up in the middle seasons. In that episode, Squidward organizes a strike for fair wages, and Mr. Krabs responds by attempting to replace both Squidward and SpongeBob. When the two strikers cause extensive damage to the Krusty Krab in the episode's final act, Mr. Krabs calculates the cost of the damage and compels them to work off the debt, which the show's own visual logic suggests would take longer than either character's natural lifespan to accomplish, ending on an image of both of them as elderly skeletons still working at the register. The episode treats this as a comedic endpoint. It is dark in a way the early seasons were capable of being dark, which is to say that the darkness serves the joke, and the joke acknowledges the darkness are there simultaneously. The middle seasons lost that balance, leaning into the darkness without the joke doing enough work alongside it. What distinguishes the Flanderization conversation around Mr. Krabs from similar conversations about other characters in the same show is the specificity of what was lost. Patrick Starr's Flanderization, across the same middle season period, is widely discussed as the transformation of an endearing dimwit into something that caused active harm to the characters around him through his stupidity. Squidward's worst episodes involve a quality of suffering that tips from comedy into something more uncomfortable. Both of those Flanderizations describe something being added to a character, an extreme version of a trait they already had. Mr. Krabs' Flanderization describes something being removed. The poverty backstory, the Navy history, the Pearl relationship, the capacity for genuine if brief remorse. None of these disappeared from the text of the show entirely, but they stopped being actively integrated into the storytelling around the greed, the way the first 5 seasons integrated them. The greed ran without reference to those roots, which is what made it feel like a different, flatter kind of greed, rather than simply a more extreme version of the one Hillenburg built. Clancy Brown's voice work across the entire run holds a consistency that the written behavior does not always match in the middle seasons, which is its own evidence for how the Flanderization operated at the level of script rather than performance. Brown brings the same qualities to Mr. Krabs in the 7th season as in the 3rd, the piratey warmth, the laugh at its established rhythm, the voice capable of tenderness and genuine humor when the writing gives it situations where those qualities have room to operate. The voice was not Flanderized. What changed was the writing around it, which stopped providing situations where the other qualities the voice could produce were relevant to the story being told, focusing almost entirely on the single note the character had always been able to hit without creative effort. The recovery associated with Hillenburg's return to production is most visible in the moments where the early season roots become legible again inside later material. An episode that places Mr. Krabs in genuine tension between money and something he cares about more, Pearl's well-being, or SpongeBob's loyalty, or some piece of his own history that predates the Krusty Krab, tends to produce the version of the character that reads like the one the first 5 seasons established. Those moments of competing pressure were what the early seasons were built on. The greed always present, but always in conversation with something else. And the Flanderization was precisely the process by which that conversation was replaced with an unobstructed path from financial stimulus to financial response. 2 decades of changing creative leadership, shifting production priorities, and writers' rooms with varying degrees of connection to the original conception have produced a record that contains both versions of this character across a span of episodes long enough that new viewers encountering the show today will move through both of them without necessarily understanding that they represent different periods, with different people making different decisions. The Mr. Krabs who regrets the 62 cents is in the same catalog as the Mr. Krabs who laughs at plankton in the road. The Mr. Krabs who gets emotional going through his Navy chest is in the same run as the Mr. Krabs who builds the rocket to Mars. The show contains all of it, and the fan community has spent 20 years trying to develop a framework for understanding both versions as part of the same character, rather than as 2 separate characters sharing a name and a voice. The most honest version of that framework is probably the simplest one. The greed was always there, rooted in a childhood the show revealed in detail only once, and then mostly left alone. And the storytelling around the greed was sometimes strong enough to hold it in tension with everything else the character was, and sometimes not. When the storytelling was strong enough, a recognizable person emerged from the cartoon shell, someone whose worst impulse was legible as the distorted survival logic of a boy who had worn rags to school and been called by a name that told him what the world thought he was worth. When the storytelling was not strong enough, the impulse ran alone, and the person behind it became harder to find. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 25 years of creative decisions shaped and reshaped the greed without ever changing the character's name, or his voice, or the cash register behind him. What sits underneath all of it, unchanged and deliberately unexplained for the entire run, is the one relationship that the Flanderization never fully reached, and the question at the center of it that the show's own creator refused to answer until the day he died. Section 9, Mother of Pearl Anchors. Sit on the ocean floor as objects of weight and function, built to hold things in place against whatever force might otherwise pull them away. The anchor home, where Mr. Krabs and Pearl live together in Bikini Bottom, carries that quality in a way the show has never made explicit, but has never needed to, because the image does the work on its own. A crab and a whale, living inside the thing boats use to stay put. In a domestic arrangement, the show has presented across more than 25 years of episodes without once offering an explanation for how it came to exist, or why the two creatures inside it are so different from each other. Every other impossible thing in Bikini Bottom gets absorbed by the cartoon logic of the world. This particular impossibility has always sat slightly differently, because unlike talking crabs and sentient sponges, the gap between a crustacean and a sperm whale is a gap the show itself seems to know is there, and seems to have decided, deliberately and permanently, to leave unfilled. Steven Hillenburg made that decision, and held it for the rest of his life. According to Vincent Waller, the show's creative director, Hillenburg received a substantial volume of correspondence over the years, from viewers who wanted the gap filled, who wanted to know how Pearl ended up in Mr. Krabs' family, where her mother was, and what had happened to the whale, who should logically be somewhere in the story. The letters were consistent enough and numerous enough that the question reached the writer's room formally, where an actual episode was developed during the 5th season, outlined and moved into early stages of production, built specifically to address Pearl's origin and explain the species gap the audience had been asking about since the 1st season. Hillenburg stopped it before it could move further. He was, in Waller's description, very much against solving the mystery, and his opposition was sufficient to shelve the episode without the explanation it would have provided ever reaching the screen. The maximum amount of information the official record contains about Mrs. Krabs comes from a trivia book published in 2000 and written by a former SpongeBob writer named David Fain. In that book, Mr. Krabs explains Pearl's whale nature by saying she takes after her mother. The sentence confirms that Pearl's mother was a whale, that she and Mr. Krabs were together in a way that produced Pearl, and nothing further. It does not give the mother a name. It does not say where she is or what happened between the relationship and the anchor home. It does not clarify whether she left or died, or exists somewhere in Bikini Bottom without appearing in the show. The confirmation that a mother exists and was a whale is the ceiling of what official sources have ever provided, and even that ceiling was reached through merchandise rather than through an episode that could have given the confirmation space and weight. What this means for Mr. Krabs as a character is something the show has never said directly, but has consistently implied through the texture of the domestic life it depicts. He is raising Pearl alone. Whatever the arrangement was before the anchor home and the Krusty Krab and the teenage whale asking for mall money, what exists now is a single father and his daughter, and the show treats that arrangement as unremarkable rather than as something requiring narrative resolution. Pearl has what she needs in Mr. Krabs. The absent mother is an absence rather than a wound the storyline is trying to close. Hillenburg apparently believed that keeping it an absence was not only acceptable, but preferable, that whatever the show could put on screen to explain it would diminish something rather than complete it, and that the question itself carried more value than any available answer. Pearl was named after the phrase her father uses in moments of shock. Mother of Pearl is the exclamation Mr. Krabs produces reflexively when something startles or frightens him, a piece of nautical language repurposed as a verbal tick that has been part of his characterization since the early seasons. Her name is embedded in his most involuntary response, which means he has been saying her name without knowing that is what he is doing, every time the world surprises him across the entire run of the show. Whether Hillenburg built that connection in deliberately from the beginning, or recognized it as the character developed and chose to preserve it, is not something the documented production history confirms, but the connection is there either way, woven into the character's most reflexive behavior in a way that is easy to miss until someone points at it, and then impossible to unsee. Her inheritance is established in the show's own supplemental material. Pearl will receive the Krusty Krab when she is old enough to take it over. The restaurant that started as a bankrupt retirement home with one painted letter, the formula that came together accidentally during a fight in a dump, the decades of greed and wacky bucks and jellyfish factories and 62-cent transactions and psychological operations. All of it has a stated destination, and the destination is the teenage whale who finds her father embarrassing and wants to rename the restaurant something that does not sound like a digestive complaint. Mr. Krabs is building something. The thing he is building it for is Pearl, which is the piece of the character that the Flanderization of the middle seasons never managed to reach, the relationship that stayed legible as something real even when everything else about him was running on a single unobstructed note. Fan theories about Pearl's origin have accumulated across the show's entire run, with the specific persistence of questions that the official record has refused to answer. The one that appears most consistently in community discussions over the years involves whalers, the real-world practice of hunting whales commercially, and positions Mr. Krabs as someone who encountered Pearl as a calf after her mother had already been killed. In this reading, he took the orphaned whale in and raised her as his own, which explains the species gap without requiring a biological impossibility, and also provides an internal logic for something else the show has established without explaining, which is Mr. Krabs' notably intense reaction to fishing hooks in episodes where they appear. If his connection to Pearl began with her mother's death at the hands of hunters, then the instruments associated with the hunting of large sea creatures carry a history for him that the show never names, but that the theory makes legible as a form of grief translated into phobia. This theory is not confirmed by any documented production detail and should be understood as what it is, a creative response to a deliberate absence rather than a hidden truth waiting to be discovered. But its durability across more than 2 decades of fan conversation says something about the quality of the question it is trying to answer, which is that the question demands a story carrying the same emotional weight as the relationship it would explain. A species gap between a crab and a whale is not, in the world of Bikini Bottom, inherently more strange than any other combination of creatures sharing a domestic life. What makes this particular gap feel like it contains a story is the way the show has always positioned Pearl's father, not as someone who casually ended up raising a whale, but as someone for whom Pearl is the one genuine, consistent soft spot in a life defined by its hardness. That does not have to have a tragedy behind it, but the theory that does give it a tragedy is the one that has lasted. A second theory, considerably gentler in its construction, proposes that Mr. Krabs was Pearl's godfather rather than her biological father, and that her whale parents died or were otherwise lost, leaving her in his custody through whatever arrangement the logic of Bikini Bottom's world permits. This version does not require a specific tragedy connected to human commercial practices and places the loss more abstractly within the show's internal geography. It has attracted less sustained fan attention than the whaler theory, possibly because it accounts for the species gap without doing the additional work of explaining the hook phobia, which the whaler theory handles simultaneously, and which therefore gives the whaler reading more explanatory breadth for the same speculative investment. Both theories, and every version of the origin story fans have constructed in the years, the show refused to provide one, share a structural feature. They all require a loss. Pearl's mother is not present, and any account of how Pearl ended up in an anchor home with a crab has to pass through the moment of her mother's absence and explain what produced it. The show has spent 25 years treating that absence as a feature rather than a gap, as something that gives the Pearl and Mr. Krabs relationship its specific emotional texture rather than something that leaves the relationship incomplete. Hillenburg's insistence on protecting the mystery was, in this reading, a recognition that the texture produced by the unanswered question was more valuable to the show than the texture any specific answer could provide. The absent mother surfaces occasionally in the show's peripheral material without ever being given enough content to become a character. The trivia book line about Pearl taking after her is the most substantive reference. The episode Married to Money contains a moment where Mr. Krabs tells Pearl he may have found her a new mother, which is the first time Mrs. Krabs is referenced directly within an episode, and which produces from Pearl a response of immediate, strong resistance, suggesting that however long her mother has been gone, Pearl has a relationship to that absence that does not welcome replacement. The moment is brief, and the show does not press further into what it reveals, but it establishes that Pearl knows she had a mother, knows that mother is not present, and has her own feelings about that fact that are not simply neutral acceptance of an unremarkable situation. The relationship between Pearl and Mr. Krabs is, in the context of everything this video has examined, the clearest evidence that the greed has always been in conversation with something else, even in the episodes where the conversation was hardest to hear. The factory exists, the wacky bucks exist, the 2 weeks exist, the mallet exists. They all belong to the record alongside the episodes where Mr. Krabs watches Pearl dance at a school event, and the emotion on his face is not about money, alongside the moments where she asks for something, and he finds a way to provide it at a cost to himself that he would never accept from any other relationship in his life. Both things are true of the same character, and the greed and the love have always been part of the same story, rather than contradictions that need to be resolved into a single verdict. Hillenburg died in November of 2018, after a battle with a neurological illness that had been reported in the period preceding his death. His passing closed the question of whether the Pearl origin episode that had been developed and shelved during the 5th season would ever be revisited, while the person most committed to leaving it unresolved was still in a position to object. Waller confirmed afterward that protecting the mystery had been Hillenburg's sustained and genuine position, held for reasons he did not always articulate explicitly, but that he maintained with real conviction across every year of his connection to the show. The episode remains shelved, its contents undescribed in any public account, its existence confirmed, but its specifics belonging to the same category of deliberate absence as the thing it would have explained. Whether the show's current creative team will eventually choose to revisit that ground is a question the years since Hillenburg's death have not yet answered. The mystery has remained intact through the spin-off series and the additional seasons that have followed, which suggests either that the commitment to protecting it survived the transition in creative leadership, or that no one has yet felt the specific pull toward resolution that would make the attempt worthwhile, against the weight of what Hillenburg clearly believed it was worth to leave it alone. What the unanswered question has done, across the decades of its existence, is give the greed a dimension it could not carry on its own. Understanding Mr. Krabs requires understanding what the money is accumulating toward, and the answer is not the restaurant, or the formula, or the particular sound a cash register makes when it opens. The answer is the whale in the anchor home, the teenager who will inherit everything, the daughter who hears her name every time her father is startled, who gets the mall money that everyone else gets in counterfeit currency, who has been living inside the one relationship in Mr. Krabs' life that the Flanderization of 10 seasons never quite managed to hollow out. The mother of pearl is the phrase he has always had ready for moments of shock, and the mother of pearl is the absence at the center of the one thing that is always, across every version of himself the show has produced, mattered to him more than money. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The mystery at the center of Mr. Krabs' only genuine soft spot was protected by the show's creator until the end, and remains officially unanswered. What comes next is the final chapter, where the full picture assembled across 9 sections becomes the question the whole video has been building toward. Section 10. What the greed actually is. Eugene Harold Krabs found a penny at a carnival. He had to ask his only friend what it was, because money had been absent enough from his daily experience that the object in his hand was genuinely unidentifiable to him before someone explained it. He was wearing clothes made from old rags, sewn together by his mother, who had nothing else to use, and the other children at school had been calling him Rag Boy long enough that the name had stopped being an insult and become simply a description of the fixed distance between him and the world they all shared. The penny was the first time anything suggested that distance could be closed rather than simply endured. He spent it on a balloon for plankton. That detail, small enough that a viewer encountering it once in a 5th season flashback could easily lose it in the surrounding comedy, is the detail that makes everything else in this video legible in a specific way, rather than in the general way greed in a cartoon character is usually legible. The boy who found his first piece of money and immediately gave it to someone else is the same person who, decades later, traded that same someone else for 62 cents. The distance between the balloon and the 62 cents is not a simple line of increasing corruption. It is the record of what the world taught someone about what money meant, and what it was for, and what happened to people who did not have enough of it. Accumulated across a childhood in rags and a war, and a period of depression the show names plainly, in a training video parody, without dwelling on what it actually cost, and a bankrupt retirement home, with a single painted letter that became the foundation of everything he built afterward. Each chapter of this video has examined one inflection point in that record. The Navy service that gave him a nickname built around physical toughness, and a photograph of 4 men he apparently cared enough about to keep in a chest for decades after the service ended. The post-war depression that the show places between the Navy and the restaurant, without filling in the specific texture of what that period felt like from inside it. The Krusty Krab itself, converted from a failing retirement home through the economy of a single letter, a K painted over an R on a sign that was already there, because a man coming out of a military depression who had spent his entire childhood poor understood, when he saw a distressed property at a distressed price, that this was the kind of opening poverty had always prepared him to recognize and take before the chance closed. The formula that sits at the center of everything Mr. Krabs has built arrived through chaos rather than craft, ingredients falling into batter during a fistfight over a piece of paper that tore in half, producing something better than the thing both boys had been deliberately trying to make. He protected his half of that paper and built an empire around what fell into it by accident, and the other half went home with the person who had been his only friend, and neither of them has ever fully walked away from the afternoon it tore. The formula is not just a recipe. Inside the arc this video has traced, it is the physical remnant of the last relationship Mr. Krabs ever fully trusted, preserved in a document whose other half sits across the street, guarded by the one person in Bikini Bottom who understood without needing it explained exactly what Mr. Krabs started with and what he had to do to get where he ended up. Born-again Krabs put a number on something the show had always implied without quantifying. 62 cents is what a person's unconditional loyalty is worth, in a specific transaction, on a specific evening, when a supernatural entity with money in his pocket offers a crab a choice between the money and the person who had just publicly staked his own soul on that crab's better nature. The transaction took less time than the question, and the question was about the amount rather than about anything else. The show gave that moment Squidward's moral verdict, and then something approaching genuine regret, and then the comedy covered it, and the next episode began. But the number stayed in the record, available for every subsequent episode to sit in relation to, a fixed point, against which the behavior that followed could always be measured. The jellyfish factory was built behind a promise. SpongeBob was told the jellyfish would be comfortable, and he complied with everything that followed on the strength of that promise, catching every creature in a field he had spent years learning intimately, delivering them in good faith to an operation he could not see, because his employer had given his word, and SpongeBob understood words to mean what they said. The factory behind the promise was the operation Mr. Krabs had always intended, and the promise was labor management rather than a real commitment, the specific language required to make the labor available, rather than the specific intention to honor the condition attached to it. The ecosystem that SpongeBob loved was a resource. The promise was the tool that made the resource accessible. The distinction between the two was invisible to the person who trusted it, and entirely clear to the person who made it. 2 weeks of daily manufactured terror represent the point in this video's account where the greed stops being about accumulation and becomes something that operates without even a financial justification to organize it around. Mr. Krabs did not profit from those 2 weeks in any way the episode acknowledges. The formula was not at risk for any of the days the disguise operation was running, because the attack that threatened the formula had already been repelled on the day Pearl walked through the door. What the operation produced was not revenue or security or even meaningful competitive advantage. It produced the image of his neighbor lying in a road, and his response to that image was the laugh the show had spent years training the audience to read as financial satisfaction, applied to an outcome that had nothing to do with finance. The greed in that moment was running without reference to money at all, which is what greed eventually becomes once it has operated long enough without the checks that might redirect it. The mallet in Out of the Picture followed from information rather than from existing hostility toward the person carrying it. An appraiser told Mr. Krabs a true thing about how markets function, and Mr. Krabs applied that true thing to the most direct available solution, with the same logic he applies to every piece of financial information he receives. The Arctic, rock bottom, Mars, and the mallet were sequential stages of a project that the story ended before the project could be completed, resolved by a structural accident rather than any decision Mr. Krabs made to stop. The project was not interrupted by conscience or by consequence. It was interrupted by the ceiling falling in at the right moment, which is a very specific kind of mercy that the episode offers, without naming it as such. Across all of these inflection points, one thing remains consistent, in a way that the Flanderization of the middle seasons, the most significant creative shift in the character's long history, never fully reached. Pearl, the restaurant that started as a painted letter on a retirement home sign, is hers when she is old enough to take it. The formula that fell together accidentally during a fight between two children is the foundation of what she will inherit. Every dollar accumulated through means the show has variously staged as comedy, dark comedy, and something that required a different vocabulary than either, is building toward the anchor home and the teenager inside it who finds her father embarrassing and wants to rename the restaurant something that does not sound like a gastric condition. The Flanderization changed what the greed looked like in operation. It did not change what the greed was building toward. The mother who should be somewhere in that picture is the one question the show spent its entire run refusing to answer, not through oversight or incomplete world building, but through the deliberate, actively defended conviction of the person who built the show that the question was worth more than any answer the screen could provide. Steven Hillenburg took that conviction with him, and the anchor home remains a home with one parent in it, and the specific loss that produced that arrangement stays in the space where the show has always refused to put anything. Pearl knows she had a mother. Pearl does not have a mother. Whatever happened in the space between those two facts is the territory Hillenburg protected, and the weight it adds to the relationship that is still there. The crab who says his daughter's name in moments of shock and builds everything he has for the whale who will eventually take it over is exactly the weight an explanation might have reduced. What this video has been assembling, section by section, is not a prosecution of Mr. Krabs as a character, though the material it has drawn on includes behavior that operates in registers well beyond cartoon greed's ordinary territory. It is closer to an attempt at understanding what the greed actually is, when the whole record is visible at once, when the rag boy and the Navy veteran and the restaurant owner and the man with the mallet are all understood as parts of the same continuous life, rather than as different versions of the same character produced by different creative teams making different decisions in different years. The answer the material suggests is not a comfortable one, but it is a legible one. The greed is survival logic that outlasted the conditions that made it logical. A child who grew up poor enough to have his clothing taken off him in public by a grown adult who needed something to wipe down a boat learned, through that experience, and through every experience of exclusion that surrounded it, that money was the mechanism by which the world's cruelty became optional, rather than automatic. Having money meant no one could do what Old Man Jenkins did with the rags. Having more money meant more distance between the person holding it and the conditions that had defined the earliest years of the life that eventually became Mr. Krabs. The accumulation was never abstractly greedy in the beginning. It was specifically protective, oriented against a very particular kind of vulnerability that the rag boy had experienced in a very particular way and intended never to experience again. The problem with survival logic is that it does not contain a mechanism for stopping once the original threat has passed. The rag boy found a penny and spent it on a balloon, which was the last time money was light enough to give away without a second thought. Every subsequent dollar carried the weight of what not having enough had felt like, and that weight does not diminish as the pile grows, because the pile growing is not the same thing as the fear diminishing. The fear is not about the current balance. It is about the boy standing without his clothes in a public place, and no number added to a cash register makes that image smaller in the way the money was always supposed to make it smaller. The 62-cent transaction, the jellyfish factory, the 2 weeks, the mallet, all of these are the survival logic running past its own justification, operating on the same internal rules in situations where those rules no longer make sense, because the original threat is long gone and the behavior has become its own self-sustaining system. The show has spent 25 years staging that system for comedy, and it is often genuinely funny, because there is something recognizable in the gap between what a person is afraid of and what they have actually built in response to that fear. The greed is disproportionate in exactly the way human responses to formative fear are disproportionate, calibrated to a threat that no longer matches the scale of the reaction it continues to produce. The rag boy spent his first penny on a balloon for his friend. The restaurant owner sold his most loyal employee for 62 cents to the supernatural embodiment of maritime death. Both of those things are true of the same person, and the distance between them is not a mystery that requires resolution, but a record that requires reading. The show built that record across 25 seasons, sometimes carefully and sometimes not, sometimes with full awareness of what it was building, and sometimes simply following the logic of a joke to wherever the joke went. What the record contains, when it is read from beginning to end, and all the inflection points are visible at once, is not simply a greedy crab in a fast food restaurant. The record contains a child who had nothing, and everything he built in response to having nothing, and the one thing he kept building it for, even when the building took forms that the word building can no longer adequately describe. The anchor sits on the ocean floor. The whale inside it will inherit the restaurant. The rag boy's name is on the sign, with a different letter from the one the building started with, and he says his daughter's name every time the world surprises him, and the cash register makes its sound when it opens, and the formula stays locked in the safe, and the chum bucket sits across the street with its lights on and nobody inside, and the greed runs and runs and runs, building toward something it has always been building toward, in a direction that has never really changed since the afternoon a boy held his first coin and described it as the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, then opened his hand and let it go. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.